Margaret Thatcher was born on the 13th October 1925 in the market town of Grantham, Lincolnshire, the daughter of a grocer who also served as a local alderman and Methodist lay preacher. Growing up above the family shop, she absorbed a culture of discipline, self-reliance, and public service that would later shape her political identity. A gifted student, she earned a place at Oxford University, where she studied chemistry and became active in student politics, eventually serving as president of the university's Conservative Association. After graduating, she worked briefly as a research chemist before turning her attention fully to politics. She married Dennis Thatcher in 1951, whose financial stability and steadfast support allowed her to pursue a demanding political career. She qualified as a barrister in 1953, specializing in tax law, and the same year gave birth to twins, Carol and Mark. Her early attempts to enter Parliament were unsuccessful, but she persisted, winning the seat of Finchley in 1959. Thatcher rose quickly through the Conservative ranks, gaining a reputation for determination, clarity of purpose, and a willingness to challenge established thinking. She served in various shadow cabinet roles before becoming Secretary of State for Education and Science in 1970. Her decisions in that role, particularly the ending of free school milk for older children, made her a controversial figure, but also demonstrated her resolve. In 1975, she achieved what many considered impossible. She defeated Edward Heath to become leader of the Conservative Party, the first woman to lead a major political party in the United Kingdom. 4 years later, in 1979, she became the country's first female Prime Minister. Her premiership was defined by a sweeping programme of economic and social change. She believed deeply in free markets, individual responsibility, and a smaller role for the state. Her government pursued privatization of national industries, curbed the power of trade unions, and sought to reduce inflation through strict monetary policy. These policies transformed the British economy, but also created deep divisions, particularly in industrial communities that faced severe job losses. Thatcher's leadership style was unapologetically firm. She became known as the Iron Lady, a nickname first given by a Soviet journalist and later embraced by her supporters. Her resolve was tested in 1982 during the Falklands War, when Argentina invaded the British-controlled islands in the South Atlantic. Thatcher authorized a military task force to reclaim them, and the successful campaign boosted her popularity at home. Her second term saw further economic reforms and a strong stance against the miners' strike of 1984-85, a confrontation that became one of the defining domestic conflicts of her time in office. Internationally, she forged a close relationship with United States President Ronald Reagan and supported NATO's firm posture during the final years of the Cold War. She also played a significant role in encouraging dialogue between the West and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, whom she famously described as a man she could do business with. Thatcher won a third term in 1987, but her later years in office were marked by growing tensions within her own party. Her opposition to deeper European integration, combined with public anger over the introduction of the community charge, commonly known as the poll tax, eroded her support. In 1990, facing a leadership challenge and mounting pressure from colleagues, she resigned as Prime Minister, bringing an end to an era that had reshaped British politics. In the years that followed, she remained an influential and often polarising figure. She entered the House of Lords as Baroness Thatcher and continued to speak and write on political issues. Her health declined in later life, particularly after a series of small strokes, and she gradually withdrew from public appearances. Margaret Thatcher died on the 8th April 2013, at the age of 87, leaving behind a legacy that continues to provoke debate. To some, she was a visionary who revitalised Britain and championed freedom. To others, her policies caused lasting social division. What is undeniable is that she changed the course of British history and became one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century.
In November 1990, Margaret Thatcher left Downing Street.
I'll support you, but I don't think you can win. And I think, therefore, you should let other people stand, and stand down.
During her time in Downing Street, Margaret Thatcher had fought and won many battles with the establishment, with the Union. On the 4th of May 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first woman Prime Minister. For the next 11 years, in her own words, her life was to be a daily battle. As a politician, she had one simple obsession: to reverse Britain's decline.
I knew our policies were right. I knew that when you change from one set of policies which people got used to another, the transition is very difficult. I knew that all of the difficulties would arise first, and that we would nevertheless have to stick to our policies because the benefits would come in the longer run.
I'm just aware of the very great responsibility, but it's very exciting, and somehow one is very calm about it, because you have to be. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Thank you.
She'd been pestering me all through the election to give her something to say on the steps of number 10, if by any chance she was the winner. And I'd always refused to do so. On the victory night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, she said, "Well, now will you tell me what you have in mind?" And I said, "Yes, it's the prayer of St. Francis, which begins, where there is discord, may I bring harmony," and so on for 3 or 4 lines. I looked up to see her reaction, and to my amazement, the tears were streaming down her face.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Hello. Have a word.
We had thought that there had been so much discord, and our policies were built very much on the faith and the principles which we'd formulated, and it was the hopes of the people that had put us there, which is why I chose those words of St. Francis of Assisi.
And I would just like to remember, and to all the British people, howsoever they voted, may I say this: now that the election is over, may we get together and strive to serve and strengthen the country of which we are so proud to be a part.
And in the middle of all this, she finally got it out, but not in the most elegant manner. It was impossible. It was bedlam. Here was the first woman Prime Minister. But she said it, and it went round the world. But the people who had said, "Be careful," were not wrong. It was thrown back at her from time to time, when everything was not hope and despair was not dispelled, and so forth. But I think it was perfectly okay. It was a hope, and it was a powerful one, and a noble one, I thought.
Oh, that was the most awful humbug. I mean, it was so alien to Margaret's beliefs about things. And I think one of the problems about the Thatcher years is that we have become a more selfish society. And for her to talk about bringing harmony where there is conflict and so on, I mean, is the most unutterable nonsense from that particular person. That wasn't what she was about at all.
Morning, Lord Carrington. What brings you here? The boss. The boss.
Coffee, and then they want us all out. Can I just explain, in case you should think anything different? The people I've got coming have no particular great significance, or those who are not here. They're the ones who are in London this weekend.
It's like coming out of the bloody zoo.
As leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher had accepted the need to unite the party and reflect all strands of opinion in her shadow cabinet. A leadership battle 4 years before had left the Conservative Party deeply divided between those on the left of the party, who'd backed the former Prime Minister Edward Heath, and those on the right of the party who'd voted for Margaret Thatcher. In forming her first cabinet, she relied above all on the guidance of Willie Whitelaw. He advised her to continue to work with her enemies as well as her friends. Many of her most bitter opponents were summoned to Number 10 to be offered jobs.
It's far better to have them with you, even though they try to slow you down, than it is to have them on the back benches arguing against you, influencing other people against you, instead of accepting the policies. After all, we only had a majority of 45, and we were new.
Prominent amongst her opponents was the Defence Secretary Francis Pym, the former Chief Whip and a confidant of Ted Heath. Although he was happy to accept the call to cabinet, he found Margaret Thatcher's right-wing radicalism distasteful. He, like many of his colleagues, intensely disliked her style and manner.
Yes, well, not actually. The point about Mrs. Thatcher is that she was against any suggestion of compromise, which meant that she had a confrontational style. That was the automatic consequence of it. And the idea that somebody else might have a valid point of view, which might be a right point of view, wouldn't enter her mind at all. No part of her philosophy.
Sir Ian Gilmore, a grandee like Francis Pym, was another opponent of the Prime Minister. He considered her a reactionary and too right-wing for a party of consensus. He thought her judgment was totally misguided.
Quite a lot of the time, she clearly was sort of hyped up a great deal. I thought a lot of the things she said were not right, although she very seldom actually said a sentence in itself that was interesting, rather surprisingly in all those years. But I thought she was fevered and very often irrational.
Jim Pryor, another landowner, became Margaret Thatcher's employment secretary. Pryor was a heavyweight Heathite with a ferocious temper. Like many of his colleagues on the left of the party, he was appalled by Margaret Thatcher's manner.
The Thatcher cabinet was never a very happy cabinet. I always remember a remark made by Christopher Soames, who sat in the Macmillan cabinet, never sat in the Heath cabinet, and then came back into the Thatcher cabinet for having been an outsider for a number of years. And he made a rather sort of patrician remark after the first cabinet, at which Margaret had torn a strip off one member of the cabinet. And Christopher Soames said to me, he said, "I wouldn't even treat my gamekeeper like that."
Underlying the tension between Margaret Thatcher and many in the establishment was an acute sense of class. Although Margaret Thatcher was married to a successful businessman and was by no means poor, she was fiercely loyal to her humble origins as the daughter of a grocer in Grantham, and often scornful of upper-class men. As a colleague once observed, she thought all men feeble and gentlemen more feeble than most.
She said, "You know, Tony, I'm very proud that I don't belong to your class." I said, "Prime Minister, what class do you think I belong to?" And she said, "I'm talking, of course, about upper middle class intellectuals who see everybody else's point of view and have none of their own." Well, I thought that was an extremely humorous remark.
Margaret Thatcher regarded her patrician colleagues as typical of the feckless English upper classes. She called them the not-so-grand grandees, and suspected that they mistrusted her both as a woman, that woman as some called her, and as a lower middle-class woman to boot.
Yes, well, I know that some of them describe me as that woman. Did it matter what they called me, so long as I got the job done? I mean, to me, they were those grandees, or they just don't know what life is like. They haven't been through it. And eventually, if they didn't help our cause, they had to go. But it didn't bother me too much that they were a little bit patronizing like that. Frankly, the people who are the true gentlemen deal with others for what they are, not for who their father was. Let's face it, maybe it took that woman to get things done, and the real reason why they said it, because they knew they just hadn't got it within them to see things through.
There wasn't this phalanx of allegedly superior snobbish people. It's a figment of Mrs. Thatcher's fevered imagination. This group didn't exist, except that we felt the same, but we never met as a group, and the majority of them never opposed her.
The fact that she was a woman added to the sense of unease in the establishment.
Plenty of height, Colin.
Politics in those days and government in those days was very much a man's world. And to have a woman running it was a very considerable departure. And I think it was difficult for her to establish herself to begin with, because she was a woman. And I think she did exactly the right thing. I think that she dominated it, and I think that was the only conceivable way she would have survived, was because she realized that she had to dominate it if she was going to be the only woman, broadly speaking, either in government or in the civil service who was in any position of authority.
I suppose, looking back on it, I found it difficult. I mean, at the time, one was determined, she was Prime Minister, and one was determined to go along with her and to give her every possible support. But it was when she started to become dictatorial and tapping her pencil at Cabinet and I think being totally unreasonable in a number of the things she tried to do, that one really got very fed up indeed. And then I suppose one began to think, well, is it because she's a woman and you're a man?
It never occurred to me that I was a woman Prime Minister. My reactions as to whether it was like I might have been those of a woman. It never occurred to me that I was a woman. I was Prime Minister. It was the greatest honour that can come to a British person, to have been given this, and I'd been put there because I would change things. So I had better get on with making the change.
To the new Prime Minister, change was essential if Britain's decline was to be reversed. Evidence of that decline seemed to surround her, in the rubbish piled up during the strikes of the winter of discontent, in Britain's poor economic performance, and in its diminishing prestige abroad.
I can't bear Britain in decline. I just can't. We who either defeated or rescued half Europe, who kept half Europe free, when otherwise it would be in chains. And look at us now.
In Margaret Thatcher's view, the years of post-war liberal consensus had allowed a creeping socialism to strangle British enterprise. Her own party, the Conservatives, had adopted the very same policies as the Labour Party and had failed.
It was the old way that had got us into trouble. It was the old way that had been responsible for our decline. It was because no one had had the guts to put it right that I was faced with the problem I was. But there were, oh no, it's too difficult. And it wasn't.
Margaret Thatcher relied on two colleagues above all for her economic policies, her Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe, and her Industry Secretary, Sir Keith Joseph.
It was Karl Marx who had more effect on the world in his writing life than any other person in the last 150 years. And how did he have the time?
Keith Joseph rejected the consensus of the post-war years, urging that the control of inflation and not the defeat of unemployment should be the object of policy.
By the patronage of a Manchester businessman,
He converted Mrs. Thatcher to monetarism, the theory that the control of the money which the government prints and spends would inevitably lead to the control of inflation. But in his words, monetarism was not enough.
We were overgoverned, overtaxed, over-borrowed, overmanned, underdefended, underpoliced, and rather badly educated. And those were, as it were, the first obvious targets. There were plenty of others.
If you took the whole thing all of a piece, it really was like trying to run up a down escalator. And so we had to do just that. It can be done if you're very firm. And my goodness me, Geoffrey Howe never flinched from taking the tough decisions.
The key there was to switch the tax structure, as we had advertised, away from taxes pay as you earn to taxes pay as you spend. The tax switch from taxes on income to taxes on expenditure, alongside a programme for reining back government expenditure and as widespread a removal of controls as we could.
Election. I was somebody who would have liked her to have changed her rhetoric and said to the nation, we are going to carry out the plans upon which you elected us, but we are now in a situation where the world is going to
be watered down to fit changing circumstances. Every fibre of her being rejected the idea of the post-war consensus that had shaped British politics for 3 decades.
She said, you know, she'd never met me really before, she said, you know, there are people in my party who still believe in consensus politics. And I said, well, Mrs. Thatcher, an awful lot of people in Britain, including myself, feel the same. I've been a consensus man ever since I can remember. To which she replied, looking at me very hard, no, she said, there is no consensus. I call them quislings, I call them traitors. Hard words, I replied. And she said, maybe, but they are appropriate.
You know, if you look at the great philosophies and ideas which have moved the world, if you look at the great religions, and the Judeo-Christian religion really has been the origin of human rights and the significance of the individual, do you think you would ever have had those great guidelines had people gone out and said, brothers, I believe in consensus? Of course you wouldn't. You'd have had nothing great, nothing of value.
I felt that being Prime Minister, she would want to try and bring the country together. That's what every Prime Minister up to that time had tried to do. But she didn't. She really did mean to fight consensus and to make people oppose each other and question each other's motives and so on.
The bureaucracy of Whitehall, the civil service, represented everything Margaret Thatcher believed was wrong with Britain.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
In her experience as Education Secretary, she'd found it feather-bedded, inefficient and overstaffed. Its culture of negotiation and committee, of consensus and compromise, horrified her.
It would be for you to take the final action, Secretary of State.
That wasn't the one I asked. It's the first one I asked.
Well,
Didn't ask about the last one. I have to approve it or say yea or nay.
I'm afraid that they had, as had been reported to me, absorbed some of the decline that was obviously accepted by past governments. Indeed, it was reported to me that one of the senior civil servants had said, our task now is the orderly management of decline.
The country has been in decline, whether you like it or not, and the task of the civil service has been to manage that decline, if you like to put it in that sense. The real crunch of the whole issue is that we've been in decline economically, and no government since the war, including Mrs. Thatcher's government, ever got back into a serious growth situation.
Margaret Thatcher reserved her most profound disdain for the Foreign Office. She regarded Britain's diplomats with deep suspicion, doubting their loyalty to the country and resenting their lofty manner.
I think perhaps the Foreign Office was more patronizing. They thought I didn't have much skill at diplomacy. Certainly diplomacy wasn't my forte. It was a policy that was right for Britain, which was my forte. And certainly I spoke with a directness, a truth and a strength to which they were not used, and they might even, some of them, have been shocked. After all, their whole culture was not sense of purpose, sense of direction. It was compromise. It was negotiation. It was diplomacy.
I feel very critical of her attitude to the Foreign Office because I think it did the Foreign Office a great deal of damage. And I think the fact that she knew that the Foreign Office, everybody knew she felt like this about the Foreign Office, weakened the Foreign Office's position. And I think it was a great pity.
The Foreign Office fought back, gaining Margaret Thatcher's grudging support for an end to the crisis in Rhodesia and forcing her to overcome her dread of foreigners. It was a fear she had to conquer during a trip to Africa or a Commonwealth conference.
As we were coming into land, she was toying with some dark glasses. It was night. She was toying with some dark glasses. So I said to her, "What have you got these dark glasses for?" And she said, "Well, I'm absolutely sure that I'm so unpopular that they're going to throw acid in my face. And so I'm going to put these dark glasses on." And I said, "No, you've got it all wrong. Africans aren't like that at all. They won't do that. They may make a great noise and cheer and shout and whatnot, but they certainly won't do that." And at that moment we landed. It was pitch dark, and all you could see was a sea of faces surrounding the aircraft, and all waving and shouting. And the steps came down, and she got out of that airplane without the dark glasses, straight into the middle. And knowing what she'd said to me, I thought that was really pretty courageous.
For all her rhetoric, Margaret Thatcher was prepared to compromise when she had no alternative. In 1965, the white minority in the British colony of Rhodesia set up an illegal government. In the years that followed, black nationalists, led by Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, embarked on armed struggle. To Mrs. Thatcher, they were terrorists.
My instincts were, as they had always been, that you do not deal with terrorists. You never deal with people who want to get their way by the bullet and the bomb. When I got there, and we were going to have the duty of bringing the whole of Rhodesia to independence, to a proper British constitution, which involved full, free and fair democratic elections, it became quite clear to me that provided Mr. Nkomo and Mr. Mugabe were prepared to forego the bullet and the bomb in favour of the ballot box, then we should need to have them within negotiations.
After months of talks at Lancaster House, a new constitution was agreed. Margaret Thatcher's practical change of heart meant the Marxist Robert Mugabe became the first Prime Minister of independent Zimbabwe.
Her strategic objective was to solve the Rhodesian problem, which had bedeviled our foreign policy for so many years. And once she'd taken that decision, she was pragmatically prepared to accept the chips to fall wherever they might fall. And they fell somewhere which she would not have chosen.
But Margaret Thatcher was much harder to sway on the question of Europe. Given her suspicion of foreigners, she had an instinctive lack of sympathy for the European community.
My first visit to Strasbourg, too.
From the first, she saw it as a bureaucratic monolith and warned that Britain had been a soft touch for too long.
We weren't getting a fair deal on the budget, and I wasn't going to have it. There's a great strand of equity and fairness in the British people. This is our characteristic. There's not a strand of equity or fairness in Europe. It's they're out to get as much as they can. That's one of those enormous differences. So I tackled it on that basis, because if things went on as they were, we were going to pay the largest single contribution to Europe of the lot.
The Prime Minister demanded that the community should give Britain a £1 billion rebate and refused to countenance a penny less. the 1979 Dublin summit exposed the stunned European leaders to the full force of the Thatcher negotiating style.
It's that £1,000 million on which we started to negotiate because we want the greater part back. But it's not asking the community for money, it is asking the community to have our own money back.
She was pretty direct and pretty, not offensive exactly, but she went on and on about it, and the others, became more and more put off by this, and Helmut Schmidt pretended he was asleep, and everybody else looked away, and it was a fairly dreadful occasion.
They were more or less, could one say so in English, alienated by the forceful tone in which she spoke and by the rigidity with which she fought for what she perceived as British interests. All of us have some national interests to defend, but all of us had learned over 30 years or so to come to compromises. And this is something which she hadn't started to learn as yet.
Although she had developed a rapport with Helmut Schmidt, she found the other European elder statesmen, particularly the French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, exasperating.
Do you know that diplomatic politeness? Rather lofty, rather patronizing. It wasn't my way. I wasn't prepared to deal that way.
We'd warned the community that we thought the budget was going to work to our disadvantage, and it began to do so, and it was absolutely right to try to settle that. It could be, and eventually was, settled by Lord Carrington in a way that was beneficial to British interest, but which could have been done without a lot of aggravation. I think that there are other issues as well, where her methods alienated people in Europe in a way that was unnecessary, and to that extent were not advantageous to British interests in Europe.
That's a Foreign Office view, I might say so. That's a typical Foreign Office view. The cohesion of the community matters more than that a person like Britain should have a fair deal. There certainly was a Foreign Office view to that effect. A little bit of appeasement's a very good thing, because if the community goes on. My view was the community will only go on and only last if each and every person gets a reasonable, fair deal.
The Prime Minister eventually withdrew from the negotiations and left it to Lord Carrington to pick up the pieces. After an all-night session in Brussels, a compromise settlement was finally achieved. The community agreed that Britain should receive a rebate of 2/3 of the £1 billion Mrs. Thatcher had demanded. The team of Lord Carrington and his deputy Sir Ian Gilmore reported back, tired but triumphant, to the PM at Chequers.
We thought we'd done rather well. As a matter of fact, we had done rather well. And we were met at the front door by the Prime Minister, who quite clearly took the opposite view to that. She thought we'd done very badly. And so we were berated for a long time about what we'd agreed to.
There she was on the doorstep. She was incandescent. I mean, had we been bailiffs coming to take away the furniture from Chequers, I think we would have been more cordially received. She was like a sort of firework, and one could almost sort of hear her sizzling.
I was pretty blunt about it at first. It was not the agreement that I would have agreed. I think I would have gone for the rest. But that was I suppose that was the difference between Peter and I think he and Ian Gilmore had to fight the harder, because they knew that unless they did, I would have turned it down flat.
She'd invited us in. She could hardly fail to do that. And the atmosphere didn't improve when we got into one of the large rooms in Chequers. She said she couldn't possibly accept it, she'd resign.
We had one of those rather ridiculous conversations in which she said, I'm not going to sign this, it's absurd. I shall resign. And so, we said, well, of course you can't resign, we'll resign. It was that sort of conversation, and Ian and I left, and Ian said to me, I'll tell you what I think I'll do, I'll go up to London and I'll brief the press that this has been a great triumph for Margaret Thatcher. And so all the press the next morning produced the stories that it had been a great triumph for her, which I think made it more difficult for her to resign. But I think I'm not sure we were forgiven for quite a bit.
Margaret Thatcher's direct manner in public and her relish for a fight soon became legendary, but in private, especially with officials and her personal staff, she presented a very different personality. She was renowned for her consideration and kindness to those who worked closely with her. But in her busy life, there was little time for the lighter side.
I think the first thing one has to remember is that life for her is a very serious matter indeed. It always has been. She's had to work very hard to get her position. She's had to work very hard as a woman to get on in politics, to get into a cabinet, to get on from that to be leader of a party, and to get on from that to being Prime Minister. There's not a time for a lot of jokes and amusement and the rest in her life.
A pretty girl, but she didn't seem to me to be have great fun exuding from her. But she did look, I thought that she looked to me as if she'd stepped straight out of The Sound of Music. She was a sort of pretty young schoolmistress from the Midlands, that was what was conveyed. And I don't think the girl in Sound of Music, was a rout of fun in that sense. She just burst into song occasionally.
This would have to reform or die, whatever the cost in job losses and factory closures. Only then could the enterprise economy be reborn. The price in human terms was very high. For the first time since the war, unemployment rose above 2 million and looks set to reach 3 million, a figure thought incredible only a few years before. Many of Mrs. Thatcher's colleagues were horrified.
She's quite human enough to understand that unemployment...
Mrs. Thatcher's Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe, announced a budget which duly raised taxes and cut public borrowing. To do this at a time of recession went against all conventional economic wisdom. 364 economists wrote to the newspapers attacking the Chancellor. Their letter argued that unless economic policy was changed, disaster would follow.
Well, I think the proof of that pudding was in the eating, was it not? Because we made no changes save to sustain our policy in the direction to which we were already committed. And within 12 months from that time, economic recovery had started. Over the next 8 years, as I say, we had the longest and strongest rate of economic growth in our economic history. We got inflation down to less than 3%.
In fact, unemployment went on rising for more than 5 years. After the 1981 budget, went on rising till July, August 1986. In other words, we were in a growth recession from 1981 to 1986. The recovery from the 1981 recession, although it was much the worst, much the deepest since the war, the recovery was far slower than any previous recession. So how the Thatcherites make a triumph out of that, I simply don't understand.
In the summer of 1981, riots broke out in the inner cities. As social disorders spread, so did the anxiety about the effect of Margaret Thatcher's policies. The concern was not confined to politicians alone.
I went from Canterbury to London every week, once or twice, and I could see areas of gradually increasing prosperity, like Canterbury, and I could see areas of economic decline and physical decay and social disintegration in all the streets as I came into London with boarded up shops and graffiti and a sense of aimlessness about the back streets behind them. We'd already seen one consequence in the rioting. It seemed to me that we accepted the need for wealth creation, and we saw that a cost had to be paid for that. But we thought that the cost was unjustly distributed.
Throughout the summer of 1981, disturbances continued in 30 of Britain's most deprived inner-city areas. London, Bristol, Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool were all affected. To the wets in the cabinet, as to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the riots were a terrible vindication of their concerns about the nature and direction of economic policy. When Margaret Thatcher visited Liverpool, she utterly rejected any link between crime and social conditions. To her, it was the liberal attitudes of earlier decades which threatened a breakdown in family life.
When I was their age, our own area had its own standards and its own taboos. There was a period, I think in the 60s, when so many of them were broken down. And people forgot that you cannot have freedom unless you have order. You cannot have order unless you obey the law.
In July of that year, at the height of the riots, the Cabinet met to discuss the annual round of public spending. Once again, Margaret Thatcher and her economic team called for further cuts. Now, the Cabinet itself threatened a riot.
I knew there were people going to jib at cutting public expenditure to keep within the limits. And I'd heard all the rumours, what they were going to say, how they were going to play it. And I said to Dennis, I'm not going to go on unless we can keep the policy going. This is what I came in to do for Britain, and I can't go on unless we can carry that out. So don't be surprised if I come up and say, I've got to resign, I haven't got through.
People were very jittery, and I think we thought that there had to be some easing of public expenditure and some more attention to social policy and educational policy and unemployment policy and so on. And Margaret herself was very uneasy at that time. She hated going to the House of Commons on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and being attacked on unemployment in the way that she was.
Now even some of Margaret Thatcher's earliest and most loyal supporters turned against her. John Nott, a brilliant but nervous economist, said that enough was enough. The Lord Chancellor, Quintin Hailsham, warned of the dangers of the rise of fascism. Even John Biffin, once regarded as an arch monetarist, now changed his tune and urged a change in policy.
My name was mud with some of my colleagues. They always wanted, some of them, an easy way, but I always had enough to get us through. I had said right at the beginning, when I knew the enormity of the task, the running up the down escalator, give me 6 strong men and true, and we'll get through. I don't think I ever had 6 at any one time, but I had enough with Willie Whitelaw, who'd always back me when he knew and understood that this was in the heart of our policy.
Were it not for Willie Whitelaw, Margaret Thatcher might not have survived. After the bitter battle of the July Cabinet, she decided that she would take no more. The Wets returned from their summer break to meet their end. Her principal opponent, Jim Pryor, was removed from the core economic team and replaced by the tinder-dry Norman Tebbit. Ian Gilmore was sacked. the Wets had never united in their opposition to policy.
Nothing to say at this stage about my future.
Nor had they taken the alternative course and resigned.
I think that there is a strong case for saying that it would have been better if a number of us had resigned. On the other hand, what that would have done to the parliamentary party, at a time when we had a relatively small majority and when we were deeply unpopular in the country, it's very hard to say. I think it might have brought down the government. Certainly if all those who had strong disagreement with the policy had resigned, it would have brought down the government. And we weren't elected to, as it were, to resign on and bring down the government. So we stuck in there.
In the autumn after the Wets' departure, Mrs. Thatcher's popularity appeared to hit a new low. Opinion polls accorded her the dubious accolade of being the most unpopular Prime Minister since polling began.
Popularity isn't the thing. They respect you if you have the guts to do what is right and to stick to it. And the essence of a good Prime Minister is not whether they are popular, but whether they are respected because they did things that was right for Britain and which raised the standard and standing of our country. Those we did. And so, in a way, the benefit came later when we won the 1983 election with a much, much bigger majority. That's the true opinion poll.
The battle with the Wets had tested the Prime Minister's mettle, and she had demonstrated her ability to fight and defeat her political opponents. Another quite unexpected conflict was soon to test her once more, this time in the international arena. She would emerge from it victorious and more dominant than ever. At the heart of her character lay a relish, even a love, for strife and friction. It was her greatest strength, but it was also to prove in the coming years her greatest weakness. On the 2nd of April 1982, Margaret Thatcher ordered a large task force to set sail for the Falkland Islands. The islands had been captured by Argentina only hours before. The loss of the Falklands was a political and diplomatic disaster which threatened Margaret Thatcher's future and the survival of her government. As she was well aware, the stakes were high.
I can only tell you that from the day that I heard that they might invade, to the night when we heard that the white flags were flying over Port Stanley, I lived at an intensity, at a concentration that I have never experienced before or since.
She saw our failure here as a damning indictment, potentially, of our whole philosophy. This would be the critical, final, irrevocable evidence of the decline of this country. And that was the thing that hit her, I think, hardest between the eyes right from the start.
As the Argentine people celebrated the capture of the Falklands, few there expected Britain to respond. Mrs. Thatcher's government had given thousands of miles from home.
Every war in my lifetime need not have happened if the European powers had handled the Hitler threat sensibly in the 30s. That war wouldn't have happened.
The Falklands War was an extraordinary thing because we'd been through the situation when we were in power. We knew the Argentinians, if they saw a chance of taking the Falklands, would do it. She didn't make it absolutely clear, as she should have done to Galtieri, that if he went for the Falklands, she would resist.
We were full of anger. They were our people. They were the Queen's Islands. They were our territory. And we thought the days had gone when anyone belonging to United Nations attempted to take someone else's territory by conquest. Those dictators were stupid. They misjudged us.
In the days which followed the invasion, Margaret Thatcher was dangerously vulnerable. Her Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, shouldered the blame for the disaster and resigned. Carrington's self-sacrifice gave Margaret Thatcher the political breathing space she needed.
British territory had been invaded by the Argentines. It was a humiliating disaster. And when you go to war, I think you have to go as a united country. And I think that for everybody to start an argument about who was to blame and why doesn't he resign and all the rest, I think that's all wrong. I think you take the responsibility. I mean, I was the Foreign Secretary. I took the responsibility, and I think it was absolutely right.
Margaret Thatcher's hostility to the Foreign Office was not eased by Lord Carrington's departure. It came as no surprise to her that the Foreign Office counselled against sending the task force, calling instead for a negotiated settlement. The diplomats warned of the grave dangers of military action. Margaret Thatcher believed that the Foreign Office was trying to thwart her historic duty to recover the islands.
There are always two sorts of people in life. One who look at the difficulties and who are swayed by those. And that was the Foreign Office. There are others who look at and weigh up all the difficulties and all the opportunities and the courageous course of action for the larger freedom.
I refused to accept that she was any more patriotic than I was, or that the Foreign Office was. But we had to tell the Foreign Secretary, and we had to tell the Prime Minister what we saw were the consequences of a particular line that she wanted to take. She wanted to take it, but I think, actually, in her heart, she probably wanted to hear what the downside was as well. We had to tell her, but it made us sound, perhaps, in her view, cautious, negative, conciliatory.
I do think it's spineless when you put all the difficulties. They wanted us to negotiate. You can't negotiate away an invasion. You can't negotiate away that the freedom of your people has been taken. That has been taken by a cruel dictator. You've got to stand up and you've got to have the spine to do it. Yes, I know I got very ratty sometimes and said, look, when I'm out of politics, I'm going to run a business. It'll be called Rent a Spine.
In Argentina, a deeply loathed dictatorship had gained popularity overnight by invading the Falklands. Diplomats at the Foreign Office suspected Margaret Thatcher's determination to recapture the Falklands sprang from a similar desire on her part to salvage her beleaguered political position.
We saw with the Argentines, I think, the fact that they were in a very difficult domestic situation induced them to behave very foolishly internationally in the hope of obscuring their domestic difficulties. That's by no means peculiar to military dictatorships. It's a feature of all political life, and a Prime Minister who has problems at home will sometimes try to recover them by one kind of activity or another abroad.
And I've just taken over from Lord Carrington, who was a very fine Foreign Secretary, a very fine Foreign Secretary indeed. And of course my first concern is the affair of the Falkland Islands, and I've already started on work on that this evening.
Margaret Thatcher's distrust of the Foreign Office was intensified by the arrival of a new Foreign Secretary. At a time of political weakness, she was obliged to appoint a rival and a wet of the old school, Francis Pym, who supported a negotiated settlement.
There's no doubt that Francis Pym and I did have a different view on many of the things, which was strange in a way. He had been a Secretary of State for Defence. He had been a very gallant officer in World War II. And he also was a very good and skilled parliamentarian. And I would have thought that on this matter, although we might differ on home affairs, we might have been very much together. We were, as it happened, a little bit further apart than I ever thought.
It would be quite true to say that we didn't hit it off, because our philosophy of life, our outlook on life, are different. And we approached it from different points of view. So that was obviously inherently a difficult situation.
The Prime Minister was equally irritated by America's failure to give Britain its full and unequivocal backing.
It's a very difficult situation for the United States because we're friends with both of the countries engaged in this dispute. And we stand ready to do anything we can to help them, and what we hope for and would like to help in doing is have a peaceful resolution of this with no forceful action or no bloodshed.
Unlike her Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister had no time for the American Secretary of State Al Haig's peace shuttle. To Margaret Thatcher, Haig's proposals for a negotiated settlement with Argentina reeked of appeasement.
I did say to him, look, Al, this is where Neville Chamberlain walked. This is where he talked about a peace with honour over a faraway country. I'm not in the business of appeasement. Appeasement is wrong. It only encourages dictators. Dictators have to be beaten. Appeasement is no part of my psyche.
I don't think Mrs. Thatcher really liked negotiations at all, or the negotiating process. Indeed, at moments, I think she thought the whole concept was in some way dishonourable, which I found very curious. To use the force of arms, it must be to everybody's advantage. Indeed, I thought it was my duty as Foreign Secretary to go to the ultimate limits in trying to find a way of not having to go to war.
The Hague Peace Shuttle gave the task force time to train for war. A conflict Mrs. Thatcher considered inevitable. By contrast, on April the 21st, the ever-hopeful British Foreign Secretary travelled to Washington to discuss Al Haig's latest peace proposals.
I come because of the very serious situation that has developed in the South Atlantic due to the aggression by the Argentine and her unlawful invasion of the Falkland Islands.
Al Haig's latest plan, which allowed for an Argentine presence remaining in the Falklands, was not welcome to the Prime Minister when she learned of it in London.
Francis came to see me in my study and showed me what he'd brought back, which was a deterioration on the third proposals that Al Haig had had, and they were worse from our viewpoint. And he told me that he was minded to recommend the acceptance of these by the War Cabinet. I was really just appalled. I said, but we can't possibly. We shall never hold up our heads again.
If you're searching for a peace formula, and a lot of colleagues in this country, people of this country are involved in it, I see nothing wrong in putting on the table what Al Haig had worked out, and that's what I did.
As the War Cabinet assembled in Downing Street, Francis Pym lobbied his colleagues for their support for the proposals the Prime Minister regarded as a sellout.
I got into number 10 about 5 to 6, and the first person I saw was Francis Pym, and he said to me, I got the final Hague proposals. I'm going to recommend that they be accepted, and I hope I'll have your support.
the meeting was about to begin. We all assembled in the anteroom to the cabinet room, and Francis said he was still going to prepare to recommend acceptance. And I got Willie Whitelaw and said, come, we must have a talk, and told him there's no way in which I could accept them.
Francis Pym put forward the peace plan to his colleagues in the War Cabinet. They joined with Margaret Thatcher in utterly rejecting the proposals for a negotiated settlement.
They were quite clear that their price was too high, and this was going too far, and we couldn't possibly go down that road. So there was no question of any problem with the War Cabinet. They were all very much of a mind, and I think afterwards I recognised that they were, quite right in taking that view.
I think that was the worst moment of confrontation, if you like. But I think from that time on, she felt that the Foreign Office had got him, and the Foreign Office were basically in the business of selling out.
A great crisis had passed. I'd had a day of such anxiety, looking at all of those proposals, and had we accepted that last one, to me it would have dishonoured Britain, and that I could not have lived with. I tried to warn Dennis earlier in the day, the great matters which we had to decide, and said that if it didn't go the way I wanted, I would have to resign.
When Argentina rejected the final Hague proposals, armed conflict became inevitable. Margaret Thatcher had prevailed over the Foreign Office and Francis Pym. Although she did allow peace talks to continue at the UN, any further talk of a compromise settlement had been killed. British armed forces now recaptured the island of South Georgia as the first stage of the military campaign. For Margaret Thatcher, the choice was simple: total victory or oblivion.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary of State for Defence has just come over to give me some very good news, and I think you'd like to have it at once.
The message we've got is that British troops landed on South Georgia this afternoon.
That need to ensure that she didn't go down having lost the fundamental battle which was nearest to all to her political beliefs, her political faith, and what she saw as her role as Prime Minister would have, I think, finished her off personally. She'd never have gone on in the same way that she did.
Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen. What happens next? What is the note? Thank you very much.
What's your reaction? Rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Some accused her of glorying in the conflict.
Rejoice.
But for the military, her defects in peace were virtues in war.
She's inclined to make up her mind and then not listen to the other side at all. Now, as far as the Falklands campaign was concerned, this didn't arise. Of course, there were rarely two sides to the question. One wanted a decision, and she gave it. And from the military man's point of view, she was an ideal Prime Minister for an operation.
The Prime Minister's decisiveness over the sinking of the Argentine cruiser, the General Belgrano, only confirmed the military's opinion. The Navy asked Margaret Thatcher for permission to attack the ship on a Sunday when she was staying at Chequers. Her reply, after consulting the War Cabinet, came swiftly: sink the Belgrano. The ship's destruction was the single most controversial action of the war. At the time of the sinking, the ship was sailing away from the task force outside the exclusion zone. This came to haunt her in the coming months and years.
I think when people look back on that, they'll see that the loss of life was unnecessary and a settlement could have been reached. But she didn't want a settlement, and she didn't torpedo the Belgrano. She torpedoed the prospects of a peaceful settlement in the Falklands.
Ships do change direction. That one had zigzagged quite a bit. But you cannot ignore the intelligence. You have their big cruisers and you expected an aircraft carrier, soon to be within range of your fleet. No, I think this criticism comes from people who criticize, but have never had to make these decisions. And had we not, and we lost either Invincible or Hermes or both, we should have been culpable, very heavily culpable.
During the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher was in her element. The certainties of war, friend or enemy, life or death, victory or defeat were in tune with her own conviction of the rightness of her cause and the error of her opponents.
Every fibre of one's being was concerned with what was happening. And of course we did have quite a lot of bad news. And it leaves a permanent mark upon you. But you have to take these risks if the larger issues, like freedom and law, are ones which steadily gain the world over.
For Margaret Thatcher, with her fondness for Churchillian comparisons, the Falklands was her finest hour, a turning point when Britain could once again, in her words, hold its head up high. But there were those who felt the mood of triumphalism had been allowed to go too far, and that the spirit of reconciliation, both at home and abroad, had been forgotten.
In our prayers, we shall quite rightly remember those who are bereaved in our own country, and the relations of the young Argentinian soldiers who were killed. I was dismayed that a jingoistic spirit should take over to such an extent that for years the parents of the Argentine dead were not even allowed to visit the graves of their loved ones, and that seemed to be a kind of symbol of the failure to build creatively upon the sorrows which we both shared.
Very considerable extent in her, and it was everything was Margaret Thatcher doing this, Margaret Thatcher doing that. It wasn't the government, and that was how it was presented. And of course she was extremely successful, and she was the leader, and she was a very strong leader. But the result was, I think she came almost to believe the media presentation and to act in a quasi-presidential way.
The Prime Minister's personality became the subject of fascinated speculation. She was reputed to survive on a diet of black coffee and vitamins. It was even rumoured that she relaxed in an electric bath. The truth was more mundane: a lawyer's training, a scientist's eye for detail, and relentless energy. Marxists, she once said, get up early in the morning to further their cause. We must get up even earlier.
She had an ability to absorb detail until late in the night, and a most astonishing memory. That, in many ways, was the most striking characteristic of all, this phenomenal recall of detail, of things she had read. It was interesting to see how she did it. She used to wade through these huge documents, underlining as she went, and one got to know the signs. A straight underlining just meant I'm committing that to memory. A squiggly line meant this is rubbish. A double underlining meant I agree, and triple underlining meant bullseye.
The Prime Minister had little patience with those who didn't share her working habits.
She could be merciless, and I've seen ministers reduced to not tears but to a state of considerable distress when they realised that she knew more about their paper than the minister himself, and that he had not brought a case together properly.
But as she grew larger and bolder and more powerful, the way in which she treated some male colleagues was unacceptable, particularly, for example, bullying constantly of Geoffrey Howe. And of course that sort of attitude which courteous men do not respond to in like kind led to the emergence of another harshness among less courteous colleagues. They, too, followed their leader in some of the less attractive facets of her personality.
I think sometimes the Prime Minister should be intimidating. There's not much point in being a weak, floppy thing in the chair, is there? But I spent hours getting the facts. I spent hours deploying them. It was known, it was my whole approach. I was fascinated by statistics and having had the training in science, first find the facts and then deduce your conclusion. Yes, I would deploy them. Yes, I would argue. I hope formidably. There's nothing wrong in that. What they may be complaining about was that I won the argument sometimes.
Shortly after the election, Mrs. Thatcher faced a challenge which called forth those very characteristics which had seen her through the Falklands. In 1974, the miners had brought down the Conservative government of Edward Heath, of which Margaret Thatcher had been a member.
Obstructed my path, and you've arrested me for no reason whatsoever.
It was a humiliation the party had neither forgiven nor forgotten. The arrival in 1982 of Arthur Scargill as leader of the National Union of Mine Workers made the prospect of a strike over pit closures a certainty. To Margaret Thatcher, he had another, more sinister purpose.
Mr. Scargill was a real militant trade unionist. The militants weren't content to use strikes merely to further their own people and the standard of living of their own people. They wanted to use them to bring down a government. They were quite open about it. If they could not get what they wanted by democracy, they would take the fight to the streets.
Arthur Scargill and the miners were trying to defend the one raw material we have, which will last us for another 1,000 years, and to present Arthur Scargill, who stood up against her. That was the objection. He stood up against her in support of his members, to present him as a revolutionary. Whatever his political opinions may be, it was absurd. And when that's looked back on, people will see it had nothing to do with economics. It was an attempt to destroy the strongest union in order to gain a command over all the other unions.
When British Coal announced a pit closure on the 1st of March 1984, Arthur Scargill called the miners out on strike without a national ballot.
March the 8th, to declare official, in accordance with Rule 41, the strike action.
By refusing a vote, he split both his own union and the labour movement.
The greatest gift that Mrs. Thatcher has had is in having the right enemies. Galtieri was a good enemy to have. A fascist dictator. I would like such enemies. Arthur Scargill was a good enemy to have because he didn't have a ballot, because he tried to excuse illegal actions. The script was written for the Conservatives by that.
Without a ballot, the NUM used flying pickets to press working miners to join the strike. In the early days of the strike, the police appeared unable to. Margaret Thatcher became increasingly concerned about Ian McGregor. Although he was brought in as a hardliner, she didn't share his desire for tanks on the streets.
Therefore, perhaps he hadn't the guile or the cunning necessary and didn't quite understand some of the tactics that were being used against him.
Well, that's absolute balderdash. That is unfair criticism, because I think we did things that enabled this campaign to be fought out and won, which we never got any credit for.
It was crucial to Mrs. Thatcher that miners in Nottinghamshire continued to be bussed to work across picket lines. The NUM's traitors were Margaret Thatcher's saviours.
she could smash the NUM, she could take on any union in the country. And what she couldn't believe her luck, that a group of miners would support her, because that's what Knox miners did. They supported and propped Mrs Thatcher up. Now, I'm not saying the rank and file miner realised at that time that that's what he was doing, but in essence, that's what they did.
The strike became a battle between two implacable opponents, each resolved on the other's total defeat.
Come on, no way. Listen, no way. Listen, no way.
Margaret Thatcher had introduced new civil laws to deal with secondary picketing, but she didn't want to use them and thereby give other unions an excuse to unite with the miners against the government's reforms. So with her characteristic pragmatism, she ordered the police to deal with Scargill's flying pickets. On the 29th of May, thousands of police and pickets fought the Battle of Orgreave at a coking depot in Yorkshire. The violence on both sides shocked the nation.
The police had to keep order, but the police also had the duty, which we made clear through the Attorney General right at the beginning. It is the duty of the police to enable the law-abiding citizen to get to his place of work.
Amongst a lot of people, including many policemen, there was a feeling that they were, in words used by a police officer, the meat in the sandwich. That there was an irreconcilable attitude amongst the miners' leadership, an irreconcilable attitude in the government, that the issue is being fought out by ordinary people, and the police were handed the duty, because nobody else could do it, of trying to intercede in that battle.
I must tell you that what we've got is an attempt to substitute the rule of the mob for the rule of law. And it must not succeed. It must not succeed. There are those who are using violence and intimidation to impose their will on others who do not want it.
Many of Scargill's supporters saw the defeat of the Conservative government as the only way of saving their communities and livelihoods.
The fact was that we had no choice. If we didn't fight, then those 30 pits were going to go. At least we were trying to attempt to defend the communities in Great Britain. 30 pits at that time meant 30,000 jobs, which was a lot. And we'd already been decimated somewhat by a pit closure programme, by communities going. We were determined that we were going to fight.
Throughout, the government maintained in public that the strike was a matter for the miners and the coal board to resolve. But behind the scenes, the erratic behaviour of the coal board chairman forced the Prime Minister to intervene. To Margaret Thatcher, it seemed that Ian McGregor was intent on losing the strike. The Prime Minister depended on the ability of working miners to continue to go down the pit. Without them, she was finished. But in October 1984, McGregor nearly caused the Union of Pit Deputies, NACODs, to strike. He ordered the deputies, responsible for safety, to work in pits closed by the dispute. They refused. A NACOD strike would have meant the closure of all working mines, and thus utter defeat for the government.
We got so far. We were in danger of losing everything because of a silly mistake, and we had to make it quite clear that if that was not cured immediately, then the actual management of the National Coal Board could indeed have brought down the government. And the future of the government then at that moment was in their hands, and they had to remedy their terrible mistake.
Ian McGregor was summoned to Downing Street by the Prime Minister. She told him with typical bluntness that her future depended on his backing down.
With Mrs. Thatcher, when she has made her mind out about something, you listen.
Margaret Thatcher was well aware that in taking on the miners, as with the Falklands, there was no survival without victory. She had no pity for her opponents, regarding them as traitors to the nation.
When she called them the enemy within, it was the biggest insult. She didn't serve in the armed forces, and many of the miners I talked to had been in the armed forces, and they were bitter that they were treated in that way. She saw them as the enemy, treated them as the enemy.
With the winter drawing in, internal support for the strike began to waver. Increasing numbers of miners left the picket lines and joined the ranks of men they'd denounced as scabs and traitors only weeks before. By the 27th of February, more than half of the miners were back at work. A majority had voted with their feet. The strike officially ended on the 3rd of March, 1985. But now, nearly a decade after the strike, many of those working miners who saved Margaret Thatcher are bitter. During the strike, they received a letter of thanks from the Prime Minister. But now they feel their only reward has been for their mines to be closed and, as Scargill predicted, their jobs to be taken from them. There's a deep sense of betrayal.
The men in this county have been betrayed. And that betrayal knows no bounds, because every one of these pits is making a profit, and yet they are still going to be closed for no reason. And they do feel a sense of betrayal, where Margaret sent a letter thanking. But what's happened? Margaret's letter has been condemned into the bin, and the pits in Notts will be shut.
I understand now that those marvellous working miners, the Democratic Union, feel a sense of betrayal. Things have happened since I left to the coal mines and those working miners that I would never have countenanced had I been there. Indeed, I turned down a similar proposition when it was made to me during my time as Prime Minister. The debt we have to those miners is a continuing one and should be honoured by the continuing government.
But in 1984, many in her party praised Mrs. Thatcher's handling of the strike. All Conservatives agreed that in seeking total victory over the miners, she could wipe away the humiliation of Edward Heath's defeat in 1974. Victory, the Conservatives believed, sent a message not just to the NUM, but to other unions too.
Margaret Thatcher was looking for a solution to the problem. She knew full well that the nuclear weapon of the Trades Union Congress was the miners' union, the miners' strike. And if she could survive that nuclear weapon, then she could beat any challenge which came. And of course she was proved right. They exploded their nuclear weapon and it blew them off the face of the battlefield.
On the 11th of October 1984, at the height of the miners' strike, an IRA bomb exploded at the Grand Hotel in Brighton. The Conservative Party conference was in full swing. Margaret Thatcher, working on her papers at 2 in the morning, narrowly escaped death. Although she survived, the impact of the bombing had a devastating effect on the Conservative Party and her own administration.
The air was full of cement and dust. And by that time, to be clear, there was an eerie silence. I was still in evening dress, because even though I have to do my speech that night, I always have to break to go off to the benevolent ball of the agents and then come back. So I was still in full evening dress. Dennis had just pulled a suit over his pyjamas, and we'd managed to quickly seize some of our clothes to take with us. and have a quick look in the bathroom, which was the room worst affected, which had some plaster down, and the glass had come in, which would have been very nasty had one been in the bathroom at that time.
The IRA's attack left a deep and abiding scar on the body politic. The injuries to Norman Tebbit and his wife were a particular blow. Tebbit had been a long-time ally of the Prime Minister. His removal left Margaret Thatcher without a key supporter at a crucial time. But at the time, the blow was not just political, it was emotional.
Of course, a pall hung over us. I went off to see the hospital and to see the patients there. I saw there John Wakeham, who had not yet come round. His wife had been killed. We'd lost Tony Berry. I saw Norman. I scarcely recognized him because, of course, as he'd come out of the rubble, he looked simply terrible, and he'd just come out of the operating theatre. I saw Margaret Tebbit in the intensive care unit. And I'll never forget. She was conscious, and she said to me, "Margaret, I can't feel anything below my neck."
You can best describe it that when you shoot someone with a very heavy caliber pistol, it's not actually the bullet that necessarily kills them, it's the shock of the bullet hitting them. And the shock of this, although it killed only a small number of unfortunate people, it had a profound effect on the Tory party.
In the wake of the bombing, Mrs. Thatcher seemed to lose her political touch. In the months that followed, her government faced crisis after crisis. She was forced to shelve policies. U-turns became common.
It became a time when we stumbled over small things and were stopped from doing some of the things which I wanted to do because you couldn't go ahead. The timing just wasn't right. For example, this was the period when we came into Westland, this was the period when we wanted to privatise British Leyland, and we were stopped from doing that.
In December 1985, from very small beginnings, a minor industrial problem over a helicopter company blew up into a major political storm. The origins of the battle were small enough. The Westland Helicopter Company faced bankruptcy. Mrs. Thatcher's government refused to bail it out, but an American firm, Sikorsky, offered to rescue the company. Mrs. Thatcher's role in the ensuing crisis penetrated to the heart of her government. It cast a revealing light on her personality and on the often tense and distrustful relations with her cabinet colleagues. Mrs. Thatcher and her Trade Secretary, Leon Brittan, were happy to let the American takeover go ahead. But Michael Heseltine, the Defence Secretary, thought that Westland should have a European buyer. The disagreement brought into focus their fraught relationship.
Michael Heseltine was not only ambitious, there's nothing wrong with that, but overpoweringly ambitious, and that seemed to be the foremost thing in his mind. It mattered more than anything else, and therefore he had to get his way.
Mrs. Thatcher regarded Michael Heseltine as an ineffective minister. She believed he was unable to control his tendency to what she called vulgar exaggeration. When he appeared wearing a flak jacket on television, her friends saw this as a deliberate ploy to steal her thunder. This was the sort of publicity pose reserved for the Prime Minister.
I think that the criticism will be made that she didn't have a sufficient instinctive understanding of some members of her cabinet, including Michael Heseltine, and that that being so, there was always the problem that sooner or later there would be a personality mismatch. And certainly I think the Westland affair produced that.
The Westland issue was soon dwarfed by a titanic clash of personalities. Michael Heseltine persisted in demanding a European buyer for Westland. But Margaret Thatcher, wanting the American option, refused to let him put his case to colleagues in full cabinet.
I did tell the Prime Minister 5 weeks before I resigned that if she refused to allow the cabinet to discuss the plans which I had been invited by collective judgment of my colleagues at a meeting of the Economic Affairs of the Cabinet in December, if she refused to allow those matters to be discussed, ventilated, explored at full cabinet, I would resign.
If every minister wanted everything as small a point as Westland to come to cabinet, we'd be sitting half the week. And you simply couldn't carry on government that way. The truth is that Michael had got a thing about this. He got it all out of proportion. He tried to magnify it into a question of an American solution or a European solution, and there wasn't, in fact, a practical European solution in hand, on offer. So it had to take its course, and it did.
Unable to argue his case in cabinet, Michael Heseltine lobbied in public. In a desperate attempt to silence him, the government leaked a letter from the Solicitor General. The letter to Heseltine accused him of peddling material inaccuracies in his campaign. When the cabinet met on the 9th of January 1986, the Prime Minister made it plain that the disarray over Westland could not continue.
Morning.
Michael Heseltine must stop arguing his case in public.
It's the only time I can ever remember the Prime Minister reading out the conclusions of a meeting, of a discussion which didn't take place. They were already written before the meeting started. Mrs. Thatcher was not prepared to allow my case to be put to Cabinet.
The Cabinet meeting was in full swing. We'd all of us, save Michael, decided we must exercise the principle of collective responsibility, coordinate our statements and clear them through the Cabinet Office. Not through me, through the Cabinet Office. That was necessary for political and legal reasons. The difficulty was Michael. Would he accept that? I put it to him, and then Nick Ridley put it to him twice.
Michael Heseltine seemed to be saying that that should apply to 20 members of the Cabinet, but not to him, because he was responsible for conducting the deal. And I questioned that. And Michael Jopling, I think it was, questioned that. And I questioned it again. And it was that moment that he decided to shut his folder and leave the Cabinet.
I folded my papers and I said, in which case I cannot remain a member of this Cabinet. And I left, very quietly, and in such a...
my speech. Anyway, that's a matter of history. What did happen is that I let Mrs. Thatcher off the hook.
But the affair damaged the Prime Minister. She was seen to have been not quite straight enough with the facts. Even those closest to her felt she had blundered.
There is no doubt that at the end of the month, the Prime Minister herself felt that her position was very gravely undermined. And I think it's true that that crisis shook her administration more profoundly than anything else until the end of it.
The combined effect of the Brighton bombing and the Westland affair was to give Margaret Thatcher potent notice of her actual and political mortality. Victory in the Falklands and again over the miners had made her appear all-powerful. But as the poet Dryden said, even victors are by victories undone. In the spring of 1986, Margaret Thatcher received an urgent and secret request from the American president. Ronald Reagan asked her to let him use British air bases for an attack on the Libyan president, Colonel Gaddafi. The Prime Minister agreed. France and other European allies had refused.
It had the effect of cementing the Anglo-American alliance. There's another point. What's the good of having bases if when you want to use them you're not allowed to by the home country? It made America realize that Britain was her real and true friend when they were hard up against it and wanted something, and that no one else in Europe was. They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak, feeble.
Mrs. Thatcher's support for the raid on Tripoli was a potent sign of her respect for the special relationship between Britain and the United States, and her disregard for Europe. But the attack in reprisal for Libyan terrorism caused deep unease on all sides in Britain.
I opposed the bombing of Libya because it was a blatant breach of international law. It was an attempt to kill the ruler of a state with which we had diplomatic relations. It was also a failure, and it did us enormous harm in the rest of the Arab world. She did give the world the impression that when Reagan said jump, she would ask how high.
Many of Margaret Thatcher's colleagues shared the Labour Party's hostility to the raid. They saw it as typical of the Prime Minister's disregard for cabinet government and her increasingly presidential style. Some learned of the raid only as the planes returned.
The Libyan bombing came as much of a surprise to me as it did to anybody else. And as the news began to come through, I was in a quite difficult position because I didn't know what was going on. Mrs. Thatcher was being widely accused of being a poodle of President Reagan. And I felt that if the operation were to be conducted at all, that it would have been wiser had British aircraft taken part in it as well, so that it would be a joint operation rather than one which could be shown, or one that could be described as us acting in a subservient role.
The Reagan's Ranch, high in the mountains above Santa Barbara, California.
Oh, Margaret.
We're so sorry that...
Lovely to see you. Wonderful. How are you? I'm fine. How are you?
We're so sorry that...
Margaret Thatcher has always enjoyed a warm friendship with the Republican President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy.
It was quite tiring last night, wasn't it?
What?
Quite tiring last
Yes.
night.
It was. Yes, it was.
They share the same right-wing philosophy, a belief in the free market, low taxes, minimum government and a strong defence.
An umbrella is compulsory for visiting America.
Ronald Reagan had first been impressed by Margaret Thatcher when she was a junior minister in Edward Heath's government.
And here.
Lord somebody or the other came over to me there and he said, well, what did you think of our Miss Thatcher? And I told him in no uncertain terms what I did. And the last sentence of my remarks were, I think she'd make a magnificent prime minister. And he said, oh, my dear fellow, a woman prime minister? And I said, well, you had a queen named Victoria who did rather well. And he said, Jove, I'd forgotten all about that.
When in power, the two leaders developed a diplomatic love affair, each one vying to outdo the other's praise.
We share so many of the same goals and a determination to achieve them, which you summed up so well, and alas, I cannot imitate this wonderful American English accent.
Based on the career that I once had before this one, you are a very tough act to follow.
I can remember when most every night at 10 we sang an old refrain. as we wandered in the moonlight down Sunnyside Lane.
On a trip to the States in 1986, Mrs. Thatcher addressed a seminar on arms control. What followed was vintage Thatcher.
Mrs. Thatcher saw this as an opportunity to get her views across to a very large number of American officials, serried ranks of them indeed, sitting on the other side of the table. And she was never one to pass up that sort of opportunity. And she talked, and she talked, and she talked, and she really made sure that her views got across. And to make doubly sure, she repeated them again, and probably a third time.
And after about 10 minutes, I'm sitting on the side with Reagan, and I notice out of the corner of my eyes that there's Reagan kind of inhaling and ready to talk, wanting to talk, and Margaret Thatcher says, "1 minute, Ronnie, let me just finish this."
And I remember the other side looking increasingly shell-shocked as wave after wave of Thatcher views came pouring over the table, hordes of them, and it was quite an experience for them, I think.
I remember walking away from the meeting afterwards, and someone turning to Reagan as we walked down the hallway and saying, "Boy, she's not a very good listener, is she?" And Reagan, face lights up, turns to this person and says, "No, but she's a marvelous talker."
Above all, the two leaders felt they had a sacred mission to defeat communism and its bastion, the Soviet Union.
Up to that time, the whole doctrine had been one of contain communism. That wasn't enough for Ronald Reagan and me. We thought the free world was by far the best way to live, the free world under a rule of law. And we thought we should make it quite clear to communism that it could and would never win, and that we would go and fight the battle of ideas between what the free world had to offer compared with the dictatorship and tyranny and cruelty of communism.
At the British Embassy in Moscow, Margaret Thatcher has a lunch date with Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader.
Still in good shape. There is one in the Kremlin, which is...
As with Ronald Reagan, she developed a particular rapport with the Soviet leader and his wife, Raisa.
The assumption, it's called the assumption cathedral, and this is the crowning place of the Russian Tsar.
Well, the other buildings are a bit smaller.
It was with Gorbachev that she fought the battle of ideas and witnessed the end of the Cold War. The breakup of the Soviet Union came about while the transatlantic alliance was led by two right-wingers, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Both now believe their common stance hastened the end of the Cold War.
Marvelous that we had President Reagan at the same time as you were in Moscow. And President Reagan was a lovely man to deal with, and you both got on so well. And I think that just helped to bring the Cold War to an end.
Margaret Thatcher first met Mikhail Gorbachev in December 1984, when, as a rising communist official, he led a Soviet delegation to Britain. It was the Foreign Office who spotted the potential of this future leader and advised the Prime Minister to invite Mikhail Gorbachev down to Chequers.
And he arrived there just before lunch on a December day. From the very first moment, it was clear here was an exceptional man. You could tell. I would say that he radiated power like no one I've ever seen. He's, as you know, stocky in build, very alert, eyes swiveling around the whole time, picking up people, darting around, talking very rapidly.
Normally, when you talk to a Soviet politician, he arrives with a pile of papers. And you ask a question, and he looks through the papers and finds the answer. And the answer is not satisfactory, so you ask another question, and he looks through the papers and finds another answer which is equally unsatisfactory. You don't get anywhere, you don't get to grips with argument.
Мы сели у камина. Она достала свои листочки знаменитые из сумочки, подготовленные тезисы для беседы. Я свой блокнот записной. Потом начался разговор. И вы знаете, я почувствовал, что надо бросить все к черту, эти все записи, и положил их в карман все назад. И она взяла свои записи в сумочку, отодвинула их назад. И мы стали просто разговаривать, рассуждать, обмениваться своими аргументами, своими доводами, контрдоводами. Я почувствовал то же самое, что и она. Нет препятствий для того, чтобы мы могли спокойно самые трудные вопросы рассматривать.
Within 3 months of the Chequers meeting, the Russian President Konstantin Chernenko was dead. With him passed the old order of the Soviet Union. Chernenko was succeeded by Mikhail Gorbachev as the new General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. Gorbachev was determined to end the Brezhnev years of stagnation and, like Margaret Thatcher, to reopen East-West dialogue. The British cultivation of the rising Soviet politician was to pay large dividends. After the funeral, Margaret Thatcher made a point of reasserting her close personal ties with Mikhail Gorbachev.
Our fundamental ideas were different, and they remain different, because he was trying to reform communism, to change it to something very different, but it was basically a reform. So the method, the argument, the debate, the getting to grips with the issues was the same. The fundamental beliefs were different. But don't forget, I got on very well with Mr. Gorbachev and said, this is a man I can do business with, a man the world can do business with. So did President Reagan.
Well, she laid the foundation for what took place, that we both had had the experience of previous Soviet leaders. There were 3 in the first few years of my presidency, and I couldn't get along with any of them, and but this was an entirely different.
She had a profound influence on President Reagan, and particularly in his approach to what he had characterized in 1981 as the evil empire. 5 years later, if Margaret Thatcher, his close colleague and philosophical soulmate, is saying, look, we can do business with this guy, that's very persuasive, I think, to President Reagan. In fact, I know it was because I was there.
In November 1986, the American president attended an arms control summit with the Soviet leader at Reykjavik in Iceland. Ronald Reagan had by now become obsessed with his dream of a nuclear-free world. He was intent on developing his Star Wars defense against missile attack, much to Gorbachev's alarm. Margaret Thatcher shared some of the Soviet leaders' concern about Star Wars, and she did not believe in a future without nuclear weapons.
The idea that there could ever be such a thing as a nuclear-free world was a great difference of view between Ronald Reagan and myself. I knew full well that you could no more disinvent nuclear weapons than you could disinvent dynamite.
During their discussions, Gorbachev proposed that both sides should destroy their nuclear arsenals. To the horror of his allies, Reagan came within an inch of giving up the West's nuclear deterrent. Only when the Soviet leader insisted that Reagan's beloved strategic defense initiative, Star Wars, also be cut, did the president hold back.
When I heard about it, I just felt as if there'd been an earthquake underneath my feet. If you've ever been in an earthquake, you know what it's like. There's no place on the ground where you can put your feet where they're safe because the whole thing's shaking. And the whole thing was shaking. We hadn't a defense anymore. I thought, my goodness me, I must get over.
The paper in which the Americans reaffirmed the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, reaffirmed that they would supply us with Trident, because, of course, otherwise it would have been apart from anything else, quite politically damaging to Mrs. Thatcher. The idea at a time when the Labour Party was unilateralist of an American president arguing for getting rid of nuclear weapons, when she had staked everything in her defence policy on having Trident from the Americans, that was potentially very damaging.
Senior members of the Reagan administration often welcomed Mrs. Thatcher's influence over the president. They shared her mistrust of his dream of a nuclear-free world.
Her influence was very constructive, and so I was always glad to see her coming. And as a matter of fact, sometimes when I was trying to persuade the president of something that I knew she agreed with and that he was reluctant about, I was shameless in saying, "Now, Mr. President, here's what Margaret Thatcher says on that subject, and you know that she has looked into it, and so you ought to hear me out on this."
But in the councils of Europe, there was none of the mutual admiration that had grown up between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Margaret Thatcher's suspicion of the community and her preference for all things American had come to alarm her fellow heads of state and her foreign secretary. As Mrs. Thatcher turned to America, Sir Geoffrey Howe became more cautious about the special relationship.
Every European country claims, with some good reason or another, a special relationship. Ours was special because of the linguistic and historical ties, and because of the enormous defense collaboration, intelligence collaboration. So it was uniquely special, but we should never give it an exclusive role. Our relationship with Europe was as important and increasingly important.
It was America that came to rescue Europe for freedom. Although freedom and rule of law had started in Europe, it was the new world coming to rescue the old. And so your policies weren't built on America or Europe. They were built on the way of life of a free society and of free people. And people who tried to separate the two had only shallow understanding of what it was all about.
In her view, I have the feeling the channel still remains to be much wider than the North Atlantic between London and Washington. So we continental Europeans had to take this as a fact of life, which we couldn't change. We did not expect Britain to leave the community, and we did not expect Maggie Thatcher to govern the country for 25 years, so we had to wait for better weather.
Shortly before the 1987 general election, Mikhail Gorbachev asked Mrs. Thatcher to visit Moscow, an invitation she eagerly accepted. She was always happiest when cutting a figure on the international scene, away from what she saw as the petty squabbles of domestic politics and the infighting of the European community. The visit also had the advantage of being the perfect springboard for her election campaign. For some time, those close to the Prime Minister had felt that her appearance was not quite suitable for a world leader. The time had come for a change of image.
I had seen a very beautiful black coat in Aquascutum's window in Regent Street, and it had wonderful shoulders, you know, the really big shoulders, and she's always looked very good in black. And so I said to her, if you're going off to see Mrs. Gorbachev, who I believe is dressed mostly in Yves Saint Laurent, I wonder if I could go and get this coat on Apro, this lovely black coat. And she said, by all means. So I went up and got it, and of course I brought it back, and she looked absolutely stunning in it.
She took with her the whole of the range of the Aquascutum latest models. And she wore these clothes magnificently. And the Russians adored the clothes and adored her for wearing them. Now that was pure feminine guile. She was not unaware that this was very helpful at home, especially if you've got an election coming up.
Mikhail Gorbachev had picked on Margaret Thatcher as the European leader most likely to influence the United States. He hoped that she might help bridge the gulf between East and West. For her part, Mrs. Thatcher confronted Mikhail Gorbachev with her views on the evils of communism.
We had the practice of not having many advisors, and we got on best of all when I had just one secretary with me, he had one with him, he had his interpreter and I had mine. I had mine an expert, so I knew that what I said would be interpreted accurately. I wasn't going to have any interpreter afraid to say to Mr. Gorbachev what I was saying. And he would bully me at the same time, and I would bully him back. Then I'd say, now come on, let's get down to the issues.
Ну, и я должен сказать, что это, может быть, один был из самых развернутых и продолжительных наших диалогов с ней. Это касалось тому, что мы вернулись, Маргарет Тэтчер предъявила претензии к коммунизму, который настроен на экспансию, на навязывание своей модели всему миру, и было вспомнено все, но я, в свою очередь, считал нужным напомнить, что не такие ангелы.
There were moments when we were there, just four of us sitting there, and round a small table, and they were leaning across this table, their faces coming closer and closer together, and speaking really very fiercely at each other, and neither of them willing to yield. Then suddenly, just like that, Gorbachev would manage to break the tension. He would sit back, relax, he would laugh, he'd make a joke or something, and then they would get back to a calmer form of discussion, and then they would again build up to a sort of crisis point.
As a prelude to an election campaign, it was a politician's dream.
If you look back at the opinion polls and things, you will find a sort of welling up of support for the government. It really dates from more or less the time of the Moscow visit, and that helped create a momentum which helped, I say, win the 1987 election.
Early in May 1987, the Prime Minister announced that she was going to the palace to seek a dissolution of Parliament and declared a general election on the 11th of June. Although from the beginning the Conservative Party was ahead in the polls, the election was not a happy one for Margaret Thatcher. She dominated her party and had become a leading figure on the world stage. But behind the show of party unity, there were mutterings about a possible successor. The Prime Minister felt threatened by rivals, real or imaginary.
Thank you, ma'am.
Most importantly, her relationship with the party chairman at Central Office, Norman Tebbit, was going through a rare period of coolness.
Every Prime Minister, I guess like every medieval monarch, is wondering who has their eyes on the crown, who has power centres which could set them up as a rival. And I wanted to make changes at Central Office, some of which would have made it more powerful. She was ambivalent. She wanted Central Office to be extraordinarily powerful, a well-oiled machine, once she'd called an election. But I think she was always concerned that it was another barony.
She began to feel that there was a moment when Norman's interest was as much in promoting his own career as in supporting her. And I think if you start to feel like that your party chairman sees himself as a successor, then I think you have the seeds of misunderstanding and distrust.
I don't think I saw as much of Norman as I would had he been a minister. I think that was probably one of the problems. When he was a minister, we saw one another very often. When he was chairman of the party, he came as Chancellor of the Duchy to a cabinet meeting. But I perhaps didn't work as closely together with him as we did as ministerial colleagues. That might have been a little bit of the problem, plus the fact that things were not going well at the beginning.
Lord Young joined Norman Tebbit running the election campaign. The Prime Minister was concerned about Norman Tebbit's handling of the party's bureaucracy. David Young was her current favourite. He was a businessman whom she'd made a cabinet minister, and he was ordered to keep an eye on Norman Tebbit at Central Office. In the words of Nigel Lawson, the two generals spent as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the enemy.
very often when I was talking to David, as I did, about my own ideas as to what might be done, how we might handle things, initiatives that might be taken, when those ideas were at a very early stage, I thought that we were merely discussing those privately. I came to believe afterwards that he had been taking them to the Prime Minister and expressing them his own ideas.
I never needed to do that once. No, that is nonsense, and I regret that he even thinks that, because that was certainly not the case in those days. Indeed, it was the other way around.
The Conservative campaign got off to a slow start.
One at a time. What do you want us to do? No, which one? The big one.
Margaret Thatcher's election tour seemed designed more as a photo opportunity than a chance to meet the people. Indeed, it seemed a tacit admission by her party that she was more popular with the Russians than she was with the voters in her own country.
Particularly in the later years, she was greeted almost everywhere she went as a sort of hero figure. I mean, huge crowds would turn out, and she got a very warm welcome. Foreign leaders certainly had a great respect for her view. And this was a great contrast, in a way, to how she was viewed in Britain. I suppose it's the old thing, the old adage of a prophet being without honour in his own country. At the end of the day, I think Mrs. Thatcher was more admired, more respected abroad than she ever was at home.
David Young was in charge of Mrs. Thatcher's bus tours.
Any other news?
The party chairman, Norman Tebbit, thought they were a shambles.
If I were to be running that campaign again, I would have taken personal control of the Prime Minister's tours. I think it was very clear that there was severe friction, that they were badly managed. There was one extraordinary occasion when she arrived for a series of great industrial meetings at a town where the factories were closed for the holidays, for example.
I'm not going to go back into that sort of thing. If Norman wants to say that, he can. This is the crucial thing about an election campaign. He had lost her confidence. And in an election campaign, having the confidence of the Prime Minister is incredibly important. Labour had got off to a very glitzy start. We'd had those incredible Hudson commercials, the party political broadcasts, that showed Kinnock in a very rosy light. And we were getting a tremendous number of phone calls the whole time, and she was being told around the country that we were looking a bit amateurish.
The Prime Minister got the message. She wanted to meet the people, but was taken instead to a dog's home. As she herself said, dogs don't have votes. Mrs. Thatcher was worried that Norman Tebbit was deliberately keeping her out of the limelight. Before the campaign, he'd brought her research which implied that she was unpopular with the voters. They called it the TBW, that bloody woman syndrome.
I had been asked, did I know what TBW meant? Well, in electoral terms, I didn't, and indeed, in government, you have so many letters that another lot, you think, whatever is that? And then they told me it means that be woman. And so for that reason, they felt that it was better to keep me off television. I did venture to say that I had won 2 elections.
Things came to a head on Thursday, the 4th of June, a day to be immortalised as Wobbly Thursday. The Prime Minister was suffering from toothache, and she was too busy answering questions about private health to have it treated.
Oh, I had that question on the phone in yesterday. I'm sorry you didn't listen to the answer. No, can't be everywhere, no, but you can listen.
To make matters worse, only a week before Election Day, a poll had been published which slashed the Conservatives' lead over Labour. At an early morning meeting at the Conservative Party's central office, Margaret Thatcher responded furiously.
Her demeanour at that meeting was unreasoning and unreasonable and close to hysteria, where it was impossible to put a point or even to be listened to. And it was quite clear that there was no point in saying anything.
That same Thursday, the Prime Minister had to go through with a planned visit to a factory making diggers and a theme park, all the while anxious about the opinion polls.
It was supposed to be the fun day out, where we would go on the rides and get good pictures of the press, and we'd actually been looking forward to it. But the atmosphere was terrible in that we were all waiting to see what this poll would bring in the evening. The Prime Minister was very apprehensive. She was not her usual relaxed self, and that was reflected throughout the whole of the team accompanying her. And we would be constantly on the telephone to central office, and there was just a mood of jitters.
You can imagine how terrible I felt. And I heard one of the television commentators say, "That's it, she's downhill all the way." But one smiled one's way round and went round and saw everything and then got back to London. Now, at no time did they tell me that that had been a rogue poll, that it was absolutely out of keeping with all of the others, and I needn't worry about it. They just didn't tell me that. So I was worried. And naturally, I had to see that we then got our message across, and then we swung from what we were going to do in the future to pointing out to what we had done in the past.
In the light of the poor poll, Margaret Thatcher ordered that Norman Tebbett's advertising campaign should be dumped. In its place, Lord Young produced a series of posters stressing the past achievements of Margaret Thatcher's government. Lord Young showed the new advertisements to Norman Tebbett.
And he looked at them and he exploded and he said he can't go that. And that's when I lost my cool. And I got hold of Norman and I did shake him and I said, "Norman," I said, "if you don't do this, we're going to blankety blank lose this election," I said. "And it won't matter what you think or I think. Now, if this is what she wants, this is what she's going to get." It was rather more fraught language at that time.
I leave people to judge whether it's likely I would have been seized by the lapels without some retribution falling upon he that did it. But certainly I can say that at that moment David Young was convinced that we had lost the election. He changed his mind when he got home and saw the next day's opinion polls.
In the event, the poll which prompted Wobbly Thursday proved to be wholly inaccurate. The Conservative Party could go to the polls 1 week later, confident of victory. On the 11th of June 1987, Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party won a third term with a majority of 101. The upswing in the economy, together with the opposition split between Labour and the Alliance, ensured victory. For Margaret Thatcher, the 1987 election victory was a personal as well as a political triumph. She was the first Prime Minister this century to win 3 successive election victories. She may not have had great personal appeal, but many of her policies, in particular privatisation, the spread of home ownership and lower direct taxes, were popular in the country and were being copied abroad.
A hat trick was quite something in politics, quite something, quite rare. But you know, it was because the British people didn't think much of our opponents. They didn't like those policies. Those policies weren't right for the character of Britain, and ours were. And Britain was riding high.
But behind the jubilation, the campaign left a sour taste. Norman Tebbett told her shortly before the poll that he would not rejoin her cabinet.
I think it's fair to say, as always, that if having been very close to a great leader and having been very loyal to that great leader, one finds that other advice is preferred, that one can feel a little hurt. Whether that hurt is justified or not is not for me to say. That's for others to judge.
I think there are some people who are rather more sensitive than others. What I had to bear in mind was it was my job to see that we won that election so our policies continued. And we had, therefore, to get things right. And if that meant, I'm afraid, one or two sensitivities, then, well, we just had to ignore them. Elections are not about sensitivities. They're about victory, because you believe in what you're doing. That was the objective, and that was what I had to do in that last week, to see that we were able to continue as government.
But many within the party had become concerned at the internal rivalries and disputes during the campaign. Some thought that the Prime Minister's manner, especially on Wobbly Thursday, was a sign that she'd served long enough.
I was present at one of those meetings at Wobble Thursday, one of the early meetings, when her performance was such that one of the handful of people in that meeting, a very senior cabinet minister, left that meeting and said to me, "There is a woman who will never fight another election again."
Pessimists warned that any Prime Minister winning a third election victory was in danger of the sin of hubris, pride before a fall. But Margaret Thatcher had no intention of standing down.
There was no question of hubris. Victory is a marvellous emollient. It soothes everyone's sensitivities. Whatever had happened, we'd all won. Oh no, my life was a daily battle, and I never gave up.
The 1987 Conservative election victory coincided with one of Britain's most long-lasting booms. For a period, it looked as though Britain's economic problems had been cured. At the core of so-called Thatcherism was the policy of privatisation, the sale of state-owned assets to the public. But as consumption increased, so did poverty. The number of destitute and homeless on the Sitpur became poorer. For those in work, the times were good. Thanks to the financial deregulation, credit was easy. Companies and individuals borrowed more than ever before. House prices and personal debt rocketed.
There was an enormous feeling of optimism in the country and in the economy and among consumers and among businessmen of a kind that had not been known in this country for a very, very long time. There was an excessive optimism, excessive expectations about what was possible. It was an area, if you like, in the right direction, because optimism is more desirable than gloom and defeatism. But nevertheless, it went too far.
Since 1983, Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, had pursued Thatcherite policies with vigour. He cut and simplified taxes. He deregulated. He privatised. But his relationship with the Prime Minister was never an easy one, and their quarrels were to split Margaret Thatcher's cabinet in two.
Nigel was secretive. I think he was a man of many complexes. He was also a man of many, many talents. Sometimes a very creative person will have also great drawbacks. But he did some very imaginative budgets in income tax, you know. He wrote the best budgets as far as style was concerned that we've ever had. And I always took the view that you've got to take the rough with the smooth. If you've got great talent and ability, then you've got to take some of the drawbacks with it.
The results of Nigel Lawson's first budget seemed at the time unprecedented. The northern industrial wastelands, and promised to reclaim them for the Conservatives. For 2 years, the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, had pressed for Britain's membership of the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, the ERM, to control inflation. At a crucial meeting with senior colleagues in November 1985, Lawson had urged Margaret Thatcher that the time was right for Britain to join the ERM. Almost all, bar the Prime Minister, had agreed.
Well, I think, in a way, we all surprised each other by the extent to which there was near unanimity in support of that view. And I was perhaps not surprised, but dismayed by the extent to which the Prime Minister was reluctant to accept that, because it seemed to me that we were reaching a sensible, constructive point of decision. Sadly, of course, because we failed to take that opportunity then, we found it increasingly hard to maintain proper management of our own counter-inflationary policy.
Margaret Thatcher, after putting up objection after objection, one after the other, to it, eventually said that, concluded by saying, well, if you join the ERM, you do it without me. And there was a deathly silence. And then she left the room.
Well, I knew that they were ganging up on me, and I knew that my own reasoning was right, and I was backed up by my own advisor. He wasn't there, but he'd put in a paper. And so I felt strong enough to say no. Thank goodness I did. We really should have been in the soup had I agreed with them and put it into action.
I went back into number 11, and William Whitelaw and Norman Tebbit came with me. I asked them to. And I asked them whether they felt really that in those circumstances I should resign. And they persuaded me not to, and said sure that eventually she would come round to it. Ironically, of course, eventually she did, although that was after some years later, 5 years later, after I had gone, and when the time was no longer right.
The Prime Minister was stiffened in her opposition to the exchange rate mechanism by her economic advisor, Professor Alan Walters, an academic teaching in the United States. Walters counselled her to resist Nigel Lawson at all costs.
If you want to bring inflation down, you've got to reduce your money. I don't think he ever met the arguments which I put against it. Sloppy Lawson, he sails over those. I think what happened was, I think on this issue, it became a sort of personal battle between him and the Prime Minister. And it was, like so many things in politics, it's a matter of power and a power struggle. And it had Shakespearean tones.
Margaret Thatcher's disagreement over how to run the economy had, in the words of Nigel Lawson, sown the seeds of a fatal rift between the Prime Minister and her most senior cabinet colleagues. Without agreement on policy, the economy began to overheat. Margaret Thatcher's colleagues saw her preference for the opinions of advisers like Alan Walters as evidence of a growing presidential style, and her further retreat into Downing Street.
I think that all people in authority, and the greater the authority, the greater the risk, can create for themselves a cocoon which isolates them from other influences in the rest of the world. It's the greatest danger of leadership, and I think that it does manifest itself by tenaciously retaining a small, increasingly long-serving band of supporters.
Sir Geoffrey Howe was increasingly concerned about the influence of Charles Pole, the Prime Minister's private secretary. During their trip to Russia, it was Pole, not the Foreign Secretary, who was ever at her side, and it was Pole who went with the Prime Minister to the meetings with Gorbachev. As Geoffrey Howe and Margaret Thatcher grew apart on Europe, Pole's influence grew stronger.
He became too closely personally associated with the Prime Minister's positions, and this exacerbated what is always a delicate relationship between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Office and the Foreign Secretary. And I think that it's another case where he was in that job for too long.
The Prime Minister, who didn't read the newspapers, relied on Bernard Ingham, her press secretary, for a digest of the news. Many ministers felt that Ingham had an unhealthy relationship with the tabloid press.
I'm sure that's all bunkum. I bet it's balderdash too. That's all right.
Bernard Ingham would try and often succeed in influencing the line that the Sun took. And then he would then report that line and said, look, this is the view of the press, this is the view of the people. In fact, it was the view that he had given the Sun in the first place. And to some extent he could do that, although less so, with the other tabloids. And I think that it did give Margaret Thatcher a distorted picture of what was being said, and indeed very often what her colleagues were saying.
Grow up is my attitude to that. It is fantasy. I just wonder how a Chancellor of the Exchequer can go through life as a member of the Cabinet and as a minister and hold that view. It's time he grew up. It is the most ludicrous fantasy. You try telling the Sun to print anything, and you look at the results of your trying to tell them to do so. You ought to have learnt that by now.
Ministers resented the power the Prime Minister invested in Ingham with his off-the-record briefings, peppered with unflattering comments about their performance.
Right, morning all. The Prime Minister is working in number 10 for much of the day, and at 10 o'clock
His impression clearly was that he was her press secretary, not the government's or even the cabinet's. And one of the ways in which he would exalt her was by rubbishing a number of her colleagues. That seemed to me to be bad for the government, and indeed bad for relations between her and those colleagues. But that was something which he did on a number of occasions.
You look at what I had to take day after day. You look at the things about the attitude of Nigel Lawson and Geoffrey Howe, which found their way into the press day after day, about the exchange rate mechanism, about shadowing the Deutschmark. Oh, go and look at those. I never squealed. Never. Bernard had a lot to put up with, and I will not take any criticism of Bernard. I could wish that every one of my ministers had done their job to the same percentage of excellence as Bernard did his.
No single government measure in Margaret Thatcher's time in office caused so much anger and Prime Minister. The community charge never won the backing of her own supporters.
I think on community charge, if the Cabinet had kept their nerve, we would have got it right. Of course, it takes some time in application of a fundamental principle to see that everyone has a fair deal. We were well on the way to getting that, and if they'd kept their nerve, it would have been all right.
It broke all the sort of laws which Margaret herself not only believed in, but was normally better than anybody else at policing. It made people in a random way, and some of those who could least afford it, worse off. All the sort of middle-class strivers and savers were clobbered by the poll tax in that random way. What is more, it offended every political law because it actually targeted floating voters in marginal constituencies.
Throughout her previous 2 terms in office, the Prime Minister had been at war with local government. She regarded councils, especially Labour ones, as overspending, wasteful and unaccountable. And she believed the rates, payable only by householders and businesses, to be fundamentally unfair.
Why should people say, I can vote for this, more of this expenditure, ha ha, I won't pay a thing, and you will have to pay pretty nearly the whole increase. That was and is wrong. So we were right in principle, but we didn't have time to get it right.
When she was asked about the poll tax, when she was asked critically about the poll tax, she would always defend it in theory. Now, you can make a theoretical case for it. It's not, to my mind, never was an overwhelming theoretical case, but you can make a theoretical case. What is quite clear is that in practice, it would be a disaster.
At the party conference in 1987, the Prime Minister hailed the introduction of the new tax.
And above all, the community charge will make local councils far more accountable to all their voters.
But despite the show of unity, colleagues were not all behind her. In a secret memo, Nigel Lawson warned the cabinet that the poll tax would be completely unworkable and politically catastrophic. He predicted that local authorities would increase expenditure in the run-up to the introduction. The Prime Minister ignored him. Sure enough, when councils sent out the poll tax bills, they were much higher than anticipated. Nigel Lawson refused to subsidise a tax he had opposed.
The Chancellor actually had the answer to the fact that the community charge was too high available if he thought he could use it. We could have dealt with that by increasing the grant from the Exchequer to the local authorities. Nigel said he could not do that because he didn't want to put up public expenditure, but that was the way in which it was eventually dealt with. So the answer to Nigel was within his own possibility to find.
Hi. Morning, sir. Hello.
In 1989, Mrs. Thatcher appointed Chris Patten, an avowed moderate, as Environment Secretary.
Another group.
Mr. Patten, why do you think you've been given the job?
Taking in front of the sign that says DOE.
His task, to sell the tax more effectively.
It's supposed to be on ceremonies.
Almost immediately, Patten tried to persuade the Prime Minister that, in his words, the alleged flagship in the Spithead Review was actually a fireship which was going to destroy the whole fleet.
I went to see her. There were 2 private secretaries present. I said to her, I do not believe that it is possible to sell the poll tax in these circumstances. I just don't think we're doing enough. It was the only meeting I ever had with her where I didn't subsequently receive a note or a record of the meeting.
Well, I'm not aware that he ever said precisely that, because he was a vigorous defender of it, of the dispatch box in the House of Commons, and made some of the best speeches, and it converted many people.
I think it was regarded as being politically tricky to have a cabinet minister on record. So I don't think this is going to do the trick. I'll battle on if you want me to, but I don't think we're going to be able to sell this.
The community charge was fast becoming a political calamity. It was widely seen as unfair that a duke should pay the same as a pensioner. For the first time in living memory, Conservative supporters in Surrey took to the streets against a Tory government. The Conservative Party lost by-elections in 2 safe seats where the poll tax was an issue. At Westminster, the charge became a focus of Conservative dissent. Increasingly, alarmed Tory backbenchers threatened the government.
Many Conservatives who were very anxious for her success nonetheless felt that this was a most disastrous piece of legislation, and she would insist on identifying herself with it in an almost perverse way, like calling it the flagship of the legislation. Well, I was irreverent enough to refer to it as the Titanic, and I think, on the whole, my nautical judgment was rather better than hers.
But Margaret Thatcher was not for turning. Increasing numbers of Conservative backbenchers appealed to the Prime Minister in person to reconsider and to abolish the community charge.
I went to see Mrs. Thatcher, and that was where the gate clanged shut in my mind as one of her most fervent supporters. And although I explained to her, because by that time the poll tax had started to bite, how others were sitting young couples in my constituency, with small children, with the husband just over the limit where they got a rebate, perhaps only earning £5,000 a year, how could that couple find a poll tax bill between them of about £900? It was a tragedy. I think myself, had Mrs. Thatcher understood and be willing to do something about it, that the poll tax would have been withdrawn, and Mrs. Thatcher would still be Conservative Party leader now.
For the first time in its history, steel gates were erected outside Downing Street to protect against terrorist attack. But the gates seemed to emphasize the Prime Minister's growing isolation. Behind them, she felt increasingly alienated from her colleagues.
By that time, Margaret Thatcher had already retreated very much into her bunker. She began to distrust colleagues for one reason or another. It meant that she was actually removing herself not merely from her cabinet, which is dangerous enough, and allowing a gulf of some kind or other to emerge, but also from the party and from the to some extent, getting out of touch with the country as a whole.
It may be that I was getting a little bit irritated that so many of my real initial kind of 6 strong men and true that I always knew that I had to have were getting fewer and fewer, and therefore I was having to bear a much bigger burden of seeing that the ship went forward in the direction in which we had always wanted it to go. So maybe I was getting a little bit testy because it was putting really much more and more on me to fulfill the purpose for which we were elected.
Margaret Thatcher was beset by problems. The community charge, however much she backed it, was a political disaster. The economy was seriously overheating. The bitter argument about controlling inflation simmered on, and most gravely, a damaging split was opening with her senior colleagues over Europe. As time passed, many of her colleagues began to think the unthinkable, that she'd stayed in office long enough, and that the time had come to find a successor. In October 1989, the Conservative Party celebrated Margaret Thatcher's 64th birthday and her 10th anniversary as Prime Minister at the party conference. Yet just over a year later, those same colleagues who'd clapped and cheered her in public would force her from office. For some time, many in the party had been wishing to get rid of her. They felt that Margaret Thatcher had lost her way, that she was dictatorial in cabinet and out of touch with the country. They feared her policies, especially on the poll tax in Europe, would lose them the next election. But Margaret Thatcher was determined that she would decide the timing and the manner of her going.
I knew that the time would come when I had to go. I felt that I should fight one more election, and then the time would be best about 2 years after that election. Also, I was really grooming several people to run for the leadership. So it was really all worked out, but of course the best laid plans gang off to Gley.
Margaret correctly analysed the situation, that she was unpopular in the polls, that a large number of her colleagues were frightened that she would lose an election, or more particularly that they might lose their seats. But after all, we'd been through that in 81, and we'd been through it in 85, 86. And on each occasion, she'd shown her resilience and her ability to come back and win an election. So she was very confident. Perhaps she may have been overconfident because of that.
As Margaret Thatcher celebrated 10 years with her closest admirers, senior Conservatives began to plan a dignified departure for the leader. The men in grey suits had decided that the time had come for a gracious handover, but it was not to be.
I think probably her greatest mistake was not to make up her mind to give up before the 1992 election. I think 10 years was a remarkable achievement, and it would have been wise, probably, to have given up at that stage. Difficult, but I think probably wise.
Shortly after her 10th anniversary in power, Margaret Thatcher was invited to Bledlow, Lord Carrington's country seat. Carrington, a party grandee and a former Foreign Secretary, had taken on the difficult task of telling Margaret Thatcher the time had come for her to leave office.
It was quite clear, really, that Peter wanted to talk to me about when I would go, that quite clear that I think he was speaking for other people too. That was the impression I got. That he thought the party wanted me to go. They wanted me to go at a time of my own choosing and with dignity. But that I have the impression that he wanted me to go rather sooner and had been in my mind.
I think that it happens to everybody that they stay too long. And particularly when you're in a position of that authority, you know so much more than your advisors know, because if you've been there 11 years or 12 years, you've had 3 or 4 advisors, and you think you know everything.
No, Britain's interests were never damaged in my time. Don't forget, I took over a declining Britain, a Britain that was accepting decline, a Britain whose voice meant nothing in the world. And I finished up with a Britain whose voice meant something in Europe. And if they were against what I said, they should have done it by argument, not by the attempted bulldozer.
Margaret Thatcher had come to rely on the advice of Charles Pole, her private secretary. He shared her hostility to Europe. But the pomp of state affairs brought the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister into frequent contact. Sir Geoffrey Howe had become one of the most influential opponents of Margaret Thatcher's stance on Europe. But the disagreement between the two politicians went far beyond policy.
I think as the years wore on, they got on each other's nerves to an increasing degree. One of the problems was that, it seemed to me, that Geoffrey Howe has a rather roundabout way of expressing things. And when he came over to Number 10, he used very circumlocutory language. He would start from the middle, as it were, rather than from the beginning. And most people know the one thing you have to do with Mrs. Thatcher is to get your point into the first half of the first sentence, because that may well be the only sentence you're ever allowed to speak.
We've achieved that because we've been able, during the 2 terms in office.
Even in public, Margaret Thatcher found it difficult to hide her impatience with Sir Geoffrey's determination to cover the ground thoroughly.
The credibility and effectiveness of our economic...
Geoffrey's personal style was very different from mine. He has a lovely speaking voice, quiet speaking voice. But at Cabinet, we always reported on foreign affairs. We always have it. This quiet voice was so quiet sometimes that people couldn't hear, and I had to say, speak up. And then he gave it in a way which wasn't exactly scintillating. And foreign affairs, you know, are interesting. They affect everything that happens to our own way of life. And they are exciting. And so we just diverged.
From 1983, when Geoffrey Howe became Foreign Secretary, colleagues had been first embarrassed and later appalled by the Prime Minister's public humiliation of this senior politician.
I think because he is very polite and didn't answer back. I mean, it was almost as if he was being treated as a cross between a doormat and a punch bag. She would delight in front of others. I mean, what she said to him in private was her own business. But in front of others, in front of colleagues, she would treat what he said in the most dismissive way, be extremely discourteous to him, trample all over him. And it was very embarrassing for others to witness.
Mrs. Thatcher would always be very critical of Geoffrey, sometimes almost rudely. I felt uncomfortable as a relatively junior member of her staff to be present to hear her talking pretty sternly to a minister as senior as Geoffrey Howe.
I think that one of the things that she had never fully absorbed is that it's bad management as well as bad manners to reproach, as it were, officers in front of other ranks. If you want to tick people off or have arguments with them, then you should, as a matter of courtesy, do it first in private. But I think that she had then become increasingly reckless, if you like, of the way in which she conducted personal relationships of that kind.
I wish he'd come and said, why not? Other people didn't fear to come and discuss. Although I did have discussions with Geoffrey as Foreign Secretary, usually once a week. What a pity. He didn't say.
Margaret Thatcher was unable to get on with her Foreign Secretary. she came to find it almost unbearable to be with him in the same room. Her respect for the Chancellor was greater. She was said to fear his intellect. But the split with him was, if anything, more damaging and went to the heart of policy. For some time, Nigel Lawson and Margaret Thatcher had been at odds over the management of the economy. In 1985, both Lawson and Howe concluded that a stable pound within the European exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, was the best way of controlling inflation and helping industry. The Prime Minister disagreed. But in 1987, Lawson decided that if she wouldn't let him join the ERM, he would at least peg sterling to the German currency, a policy called shadowing the Deutschmark.
I first found out about that entirely by accident. I used to do an annual, more or less annual, interview with the Financial Times, and one of the questions they put to me on that particular day when they came was, why are you shadowing the Deutschmark? And I vigorously denied it. I said, well, not.
Not only is it absurd to suggest that I could have carried out that policy secretly when everybody in the markets, let alone the Prime Minister, knew that it was being carried out, but she was given every day, every evening, a piece of paper which showed how much we had intervened and what the rate was and so on. And I spoke to her every week and discussed it with her every week.
The Prime Minister always felt that Lawson was secretive. On many occasions, she'd been frustrated that he didn't inform her of the details of his budgets in advance. Indeed, by her own admission, she was forced to telephone spies in the Treasury and at the Bank of England to find out what he was doing. It was even rumoured that she'd bugged number 11.
Nigel did play his own cards very much, very close to his chest, and when I found out, accidentally, and then said to my own Treasury Secretary, look, find out what's going on. We rang up the Treasury and said, look, if he's shadowing it, what's the range within which he is shadowing it? And they said, we don't know. They couldn't tell us.
She was slightly paranoid by that time and was, I think, afraid that I may be up to something that she didn't know about. In fact, that was never the case. Although we had a disagreement on exchange rate policy, that was always entirely open. I was always completely open with her throughout my time as Chancellor.
As First Lord of the Treasury, the Prime Minister was responsible for economic policy. In March 1988, she ordered Lawson to stop shadowing the Deutschmark. Reluctantly, he obeyed. But an unbridgeable gulf had opened up between the Prime Minister and her neighbour next door in Downing Street. Policy drifted, inflation climbed. Each side blamed the other for the return of economic malaise. Inevitably, Conservative backbenchers became aware of the schism.
Certainly I realised that the split between Nigel Lawson and Mrs Thatcher was irreparable. No bridge could be flung across that chasm, and I saw in it the seeds of ultimate destruction of her leadership.
On the 24th of June 1989, Margaret Thatcher was at Chequers preparing for a European summit in Madrid. The economy was now overheating and inflation was rising. But the Prime Minister still could not agree with her Chancellor about economic policy. She was also at loggerheads with Geoffrey Howe, who, with Nigel Lawson, had long been urging Britain's entry into the ERM.
I was at Chequers for the Saturday, working on my speech for the Madrid summit. I suddenly received a message from number 10. Both Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson want to see you together before you go to Madrid. And I was pretty cross. I had so much work to do. And so I said, all right, they can do it at 11:15 tonight or at 8:15 tomorrow morning. They chose 8:15 Sunday morning. I returned to number 10.
The Foreign Secretary went to Downing Street to meet the Chancellor and with him demand the Prime Minister set a date for entry to the ERM. The Prime Minister had banned the matter from Cabinet discussion.
I thought it was absolutely disgraceful. I was horrified. They did it behind the backs of the colleagues in the Cabinet. We had no idea that anything of this sort was going on. The ERM wasn't on the agenda for the Madrid summit, and I just don't think these are the tactics that you should use however strongly you feel about something.
If a Prime Minister is about to go to a major international meeting to discuss with the heads of government of other countries the monetary affairs of Europe, you would think that she would want to have a meeting with her Foreign Secretary and her Chancellor of the Exchequer, even if she doesn't want to take their advice. She regarded this request for a meeting as itself almost an act of treachery.
I was the minister to be with her at the Madrid summit. Nigel Lawson was the minister in charge of economic policy. If we had not had that meeting with her, then what should history have said then? It was our duty. I should have welcomed the chance to present the same case in the context of a larger group of ministers, because we should once again, I think, have secured the support of the larger group. The fact that we were arguing it 2 to 1 was because we were not able to mobilize a larger army. That wasn't our choice.
They both came in a rather self-conscious way, but clearly just a little bit pleased with themselves, holding a document. And they sat down opposite me, the other side of the fire. Geoffrey started and said that he and Nigel had decided, both of them, they were not going merely to ask me to set a date and specify a date at Madrid as to when we go in the exchange rate mechanism, but if I did not do so, they would resign.
Geoffrey Howe reiterated what we had suggested in our paper and said, that if you're not prepared to accept my advice, then I will have to consider my position, or whatever the appropriate formulation is for saying that he would have to resign. And so I said, and that was I think all I did say at that meeting, but it was a much shorter meeting, that you should know, Prime Minister, that if Geoffrey goes, I would have to go too.
They got up looking rather smug and left. It had been a grubby little meeting.
On the plane journey to the Madrid summit, Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe maintained an icy silence. Their relationship was permanently damaged. That Sunday afternoon, the Prime Minister and Charles...
We achieved our objective, which was Britain remaining part of the continuing debate on the future of the European monetary system. We were perceived to have achieved our objective by the press, by Parliament, and by our partners in Europe. It would have been entirely futile to resign, having achieved an important advance.
Strangely enough, the briefing I saw, which was being given to the press, not from us, can only have come from Geoffrey or from Nigel, was they'd had a great victory. In fact, had had a great defeat. Such is presentation. How different from reality.
She called their bluff. And then the most despicable thing of all was that when she got back, and it was all over, they didn't resign. Having threatened to resign, and not got what they wanted, they didn't resign.
The following day, Margaret Thatcher confronted her colleagues.
Normally, I'm just sitting in my place in the cabinet room and they all come in and take their places. In view of what they had attempted to do to me on the Sunday, I went to the door of the cabinet room, saw each minister in, just waited as they passed me.
As a person, he was intelligent, hardworking, devoted, and so on. But he was also arrogant, self-centered, completely convinced that was nobody cleverer than he was. And alas, there was somebody cleverer than he was, Mrs. Thatcher.
The Chancellor's policy soon became public. In October 1989, the Financial Times published an article about Alan Walters which repeated Walters' view that the exchange rate mechanism was half-baked. For the beleaguered Chancellor, this was too much.
I felt really that it is quite impossible for me to carry on my job effectively. Impossible for any Chancellor to carry on the job effectively if his authority is being undermined all the time in the way that mine was being undermined, apparently with the authority of the Prime Minister.
he came round very sensitive. I must say, I was never expected to be sensitive, but all of the rest of them were. There's only one woman in the cabinet. Believe you me, there were a lot more prima donnas than that. Oh, they came round. Goodness me, their reputation. Never mind about mine. Never mind all the briefing that was going on against my viewpoint in the background. Goodness me, they were touchy. Oh, you had to smooth them down.
As the economy deteriorated, the Daily Mail accused Lawson of betraying his party and the people of Britain. It reflected Mrs. Thatcher's views. The Chancellor retreated to his country home, where he was besieged by journalists. With the return of inflation and interest rates high, his position had become precarious.
Are you considering another rise in interest rates, Mr. Lawson?
As the Chancellor fled back to London, he decided he could no longer tolerate Mrs. Thatcher's preference for Alan Walters. Early in the morning on the 26th of October, Nigel Lawson came to Number 10 to confront the Prime Minister. He told her that if she didn't sack Alan Walters, he would resign.
Now you'd have knocked me down with a feather. For Chancellor of the Exchequer, with all of the importance and reputation of that position, to come to me and say, unless you sack one of your most loyal advisers, I will resign. I couldn't believe it.
She said, well, if Alan goes, that would destroy my authority. So I said, that is nonsense, Prime Minister. Your authority is in no way dependent on Alan Walters. It would not be destroyed. But I realise that you might want the current hullabaloo to die down, and then I could carry on, certainly carry on as your Chancellor if you wish me to, provided he goes at the end of the year. And she refused even that.
The Prime Minister ignored Lawson's warning that he intended to resign. At 2:30 that afternoon, she went across to the Commons to prepare for question time. As she did so, Nigel Lawson sent a message repeating his ultimatum.
Now, it was a pretty nasty thing to have to go into the House of Commons. It reminded me, I suppose, of the things they had tried to do to me just before going to the Madrid summit. In retrospect, I think Nigel was looking for an excuse to resign because of the inflation he had created. And I think he was pestering me to get the information out because he feared that I might otherwise ring up Alan, and Alan would say, well, of course I will go. And then his excuse would have been no longer valid, and he would have had to have stayed on and deal with the inflation himself.
To suggest that I resigned because the economy was in a desperate state and I couldn't face a responsibility is ludicrous. First of all, although the economy was going through a bad patch, it wasn't in a desperate state, and I knew perfectly well that my resigning would inevitably cause me to be made the scapegoat for whatever happened afterwards.
By this time, it was nearly 7. I thought the press were going to get on to Alan. I must tell him. When I telephoned him, he was utterly dismayed. All he'd done was to give sound advice and said, I said, you're not going, Alan. You've been absolutely wonderful. He said, but I'm in an intolerable position. I will have to go. And he decided to go. But I had stayed loyal to someone who'd been loyal to me. And again, I wasn't going to be blackmailed by such appalling tactics.
I had not been disloyal to her at any time. I had been extremely loyal to her. In fact, one of the problems with Margaret Thatcher towards the end was that she saw loyalty as a one-way street. I mean, she expected all her ministers to be totally loyal to her, and by and large they were. She didn't feel a similar obligation to be loyal to them.
Support of the two men, Lawson and Howe, whom many regarded as her standard-bearers. And the manner of Lawson's departure triggered a backbench challenge to Mrs. Thatcher's leadership. Sir Anthony Mayer, a pro-European Conservative MP, stood against Margaret Thatcher in November 1989 as a stalking horse, in the vain hope that a more substantial candidate would emerge. Even so, in the secret leadership ballot, 33 Conservative MPs voted for Sir Anthony Mayer, 27 abstained. The party managers were worried, despite the Prime Minister's confidence in her party's backing.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a brief word. I'd like to say how very pleased I am with this result, and very pleased I am to have had the overwhelming support of my colleagues in the House and of people from the party in the country.
Late one evening, following the Mayor challenge, the Deputy Chief Whip paid a secret visit to Downing Street. He warned the Prime Minister that many of her backbenchers felt she'd become regal and isolated. They were out for her blood.
Using the rather sort of graphic imagery that I do, I said, look, there are about 100 more people, that is in addition to those who had abstained or voted against the Mayor. They're lurking in the bushes, they've got daggers in their hands, and they want to engage in the daylight assassination of a sitting Prime Minister.
After the Mayor challenge, one of the messages which came back from her campaign team was that there was great dissatisfaction among the backbenchers, and that was something which certainly we recognised had to be put right. And so after the Mayor challenge, we set up a series of meetings with backbenchers to allow them to come in groups and to tell her and raise with her anything which they wished to do so.
During one of those meetings, one backbench MP said, don't you think, Mrs. Thatcher, it's time for you to go? And I didn't. I still had so much to do. And I felt that at that time we had changed president in the United States as well. And I felt that at that time, to get the continuity of policy and to go forward and to reap the full benefit of the changes we had brought about both at home and overseas, I still was the person to complete that task.
Like many powerful leaders before her, Margaret Thatcher could see no suitable successor. She was grooming John Major, whom she'd rapidly promoted to Chancellor. But even he, she began to think, had his drawbacks.
He came up very quickly, after all, to jump from being Chief Secretary to Foreign Secretary and then back to Chancellor of the Exchequer, meant that there were several years' experience missing, and I think that was probably the difference between us. Don't forget, I came into the House of Commons in 1959.
So there are a number of things, John, that come out of the...
The Prime Minister became suspicious of what she saw as Major's yielding nature. In private, she said that John Major had an India-rubber attitude to Europe and that he played the same cracked record as Lawson on exchange rates.
John is much more a consensus man and will much more compromise.
That seems to be very agreeable.
I had noticed that perhaps he tended to go with the crowd and the conventional wisdom, but therefore he needed to be tested to see how he would perform in other roles.
And she came to think that he lacked both the vision and the mental agility necessary for a senior politician.
If you don't have a really great intellectual background, you can either acquire that, but what is important is that you require a political instinct for what the people think. Now, people like John very much. You could not like John. But it's quite different from liking a person, from having a political instinct of the right direction in which to go in the long run. Perhaps I had developed that over the years.
There was no doubt that Margaret Thatcher promoted John Major to be Foreign Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer because she'd identified him as her successor. If she had believed then what she now says she believed about him, she would not have promoted him. She promoted him, identified him as the heir, and gave him her wholehearted support when he stood for the leadership. Anything else, I'm afraid, is a change of recollection that's come from looking back over those events, which I have no doubt Margaret has.
There were few others whom she considered might take her chair in the cabinet. She'd either sacked, lost or sidelined those senior politicians who shared her experience and political outlook. Like a medieval monarch, as a colleague once observed, she wondered fearfully who might have eyes on her crown.
I think that's one of the weaknesses that shadowed the government as years went by, that older statesmen, for one reason or another, fell by the wayside, and it increasingly became a cabinet with the Prime Minister towering above people who were younger than, less experienced than herself. I think it would have been better, from her point of view and the country's point of view, had she retained a broader band of equally mature colleagues.
Over a period of time, she found fewer and fewer people in her government who were of her view. That was what happened to Margaret Thatcher, and progressively after 1987, in consequence, she lost control of her cabinet.
The Prime Minister was further isolated by her dogged attachment to the poll tax. It was almost universally unpopular and led to some of the worst rioting witnessed on the streets of London. Conservative backbenchers, fearing the community charge might lose them their seats, talked openly about a change of leader. But it was simply not in Mrs. Thatcher's character to change policy, even in the face of disaster.
What one picked up very quickly was that some of those who were suggesting that it was time for me to go wanted to relax the very policies that had been successful. In Truman's phrase, they couldn't stand the heat in the kitchen. I, of course, was used to the heat in the kitchen.
The Prime Minister seemed curiously out of step with the tide of world events. When the Berlin Wall came down and German reunification became inevitable, hers was a lone voice in opposition. Even Saddam Hussein's invasion of the Gulf failed to revive her fortunes as a war leader. The Conservative Party remained consistently 10 points behind Labour in the polls. After years of resistance, Margaret Thatcher did finally give way on one matter. She bowed to John Major and agreed that Britain should join the European exchange rate mechanism. But by now, inflation was rising to 10% and interest rates were punitively high. But the concession of Sterling's entry into the ERM seemed to make her more, not less, hostile to the community. At a summit in Rome late in October 1990, she hit out at her Italian hosts, accusing them of living in cloud cuckoo land. On her return to London, she departed from a neutral statement to denounce the European Commission and its president.
My back to him. I could turn round and see him, but I didn't particularly wish to. And I knew that the press were facing me in the gallery opposite. I knew, therefore, that I must keep my features very much composed and calm. At the same time, I was trying to assess the effect that that speech would have, because I knew by this time some of the discussion and rumours that were taking place. It was an experience I would not wish to go through again.
The tragedy is, and it is for me personally, for my party, for our whole people, and for my right honourable friend herself, a very real tragedy, that the Prime Minister's perceived attitude towards Europe is running increasingly serious risks for the future of our nation.
The wielding the knife cleverly, so very cleverly. Too cleverly, because in the end, it was not my record that assassinated. He assassinated his own character.
I've done what I believe to be right. The idea that anyone should take the decisions that I took or make the speech that I made for grounds of personal bitterness is quite frankly grotesque. I devoted a large chunk of my adult life to membership of the House of Commons, to membership of Ted Heath's and Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, to support of our economic and foreign policies. And I was deeply dismayed to see that going awry. And I felt the time had come when I could no longer suppress those anxieties. And I expressed them, and it was plain from what happened subsequently that I was far from being alone.
and therefore I realised we were in for a rough ride.
I have accordingly informed the Chief Whip and the Chairman of the 1922 Committee that I intend to let my name go forward.
Michael Heseltine's high-profile campaign began immediately. By contrast, Margaret Thatcher's team seemed overcome by inertia.
People speak of a Margaret Thatcher campaign. In truth, there was no campaign. Only one person was running a campaign, and that was Michael Heseltine, and it was a very good campaign. He'd been building up to it for a long time. He'd made friends with a lot of backbenchers, and he pursued people. I mean, I had friends who were rung up in their bath by Michael Heseltine.
It was a very, very busy period, and we agreed right at the beginning it really wouldn't be right for me to go round and canvass people myself, to go through the tea rooms and say, please, will you support me? If by the time you've been 11.5 years as Prime Minister, they don't know what you've done and what wouldn't have happened unless you'd been there, I didn't feel it would make that much difference to say, will you support me?
While Mrs. Thatcher endured the ballet in Versailles, a group of cabinet colleagues, ministers and backbenchers had gathered in the Westminster home of a former whip. The consensus was clear. The Prime Minister was finished by her poor showing in the first ballot.
The conclusion was arrived at before the meeting began, because everybody came to the meeting carrying on their backs their experiences of being in the House that afternoon and that evening. So there was very little discussion about whether the position was sustainable. I think that conclusion was arrived at more or less on arrival.
There was every sort of objective evidence that she was unlikely to win a second ballot, that if she did win a second ballot, it would be after a huge shedding of blood and by a margin so narrow that it would be difficult subsequently for her or the government to regain its authority. And I've never heard a convincing argument against that.
Still in Paris at 9 o'clock the following morning, Wednesday the 21st of November, Margaret Thatcher signed a treaty ending the Cold War. She was unaware at this stage that most of her cabinet colleagues had decided that her career was over. Mrs. Thatcher had the first hint of the gravity of her position as she travelled to the airport to fly home. She asked her staff whether her protégé, Peter Lilly, the Trade and Industry Secretary, had agreed to help with a parliamentary speech.
Just said, Charles, did you get on to Peter? He said, yes. There was something in his tone which made me say, is he going to do the speech? He said, Peter said, there's no point. She's finished. That turned a knife in my heart. Peter was a real friend. He was a believer. And I think that was the first real inkling I had that all was far from well. And Dennis was waiting, just standing by the fireplace. And he just said, almost before I'd spoken, don't go on, love. Don't go on. I think he was even more hurt than I was. I went down to my study where Norman Tebbit and John Wakeham were waiting for me, and we discussed things together. Norman said he thought that the support on the back benches was good enough to get through, and that we could win, and we'd have to fight for it. John Wakeham said he thought the area of weakest support was my own cabinet, which was a bit of a shaker.
At 2:30 in the afternoon, Mrs. Thatcher left Downing Street to go to the House of Commons. Despite her husband's advice, she was still determined to carry on. John Wakeham, her new campaign manager, had counselled her to meet her cabinet colleagues one by one that evening to gauge their support.
The Prime Prime Minister!
At question time, she responded with typical gusto to taunts about her waning career.
First 11 and a half years haven't been so bad, and with regard to twilight, please remember there are 24 hours in a day.
At 4 o'clock, she swallowed her pride and canvassed the votes of her backbenchers in the parliamentary tea rooms.
And as I went through, I saw so many of one's loyal supporters. And even they said to me, look, Michael Heseltine's been and asked us for our votes 3 times. This is the first time you've been to ask us. And I was a bit upset about that. And gradually, as I got this message, it dawned on me that what they were saying was, look, please, why haven't you had a vigorous enough campaign? We're concerned for you. We're concerned that you haven't. And I began then to realize the magnitude of the task and how much I would need, not only a few helpers, but need to mobilize all of Cabinet to be the spearhead of the attack.
The chastened Prime Minister immediately approached those colleagues whom she thought most loyal. She started with John Major, who was recovering from dental treatment at home in Huntingdon.
There must have been things going on that I didn't know of. And I rang John and said I had decided to stand again, and Douglas was going to sign my nomination paper. Would he second it? And there was a moment's silence, and you're super sensitive in these circumstances. However, I assumed that he might be in some pain from the dental treatment. And he said, yes, if that's what you want.
At 6 o'clock in the evening, the Prime Minister was in her rooms in the House of Commons, waiting to see her colleagues. She was badly rattled. Even John Major, the man who, in her view, owed her everything, seemed to be lukewarm in his support. At 6:30, the Cabinet parade began. That evening, only 4 Cabinet colleagues offered their unqualified support. The rest advised her that she was unlikely to win.
Ken Clarke came in his usual robust, rather bruising style, sat down and said the whole process was farcical, that he personally could support me for another 5 or 10 years. But most of the Cabinet thought I would lose, and therefore I should stand down and let John Major or Douglas Hurd stand, either of whom had a better chance of winning than I did. After that, Peter Lilly came in. I already had had an inkling of what he would say. He came in clearly uncomfortable and spoke very carefully. Yes, if I chose to stand, he would support me. But it was inconceivable that I would win. And if I lost, everything I'd achieved would be put at risk. Therefore, I should stand down. And Chris Patten, the same message. And I somehow thought that Chris would have some different formula, some greater insight, some magical words. No. If you wish to stand, I will support you. But I don't think you can win. The most difficult of all was Malcolm Rifkind. Again, very much on the left of the party. And I'd had problems with Malcolm before. He came in, didn't think I could possibly win, and therefore I should stand down. And I said to him, Malcolm, if I choose to stand, will you support me? He turned his eyes away and said he would have to think about that. But he wouldn't campaign against me. By that time, one was thankful for small mercies. The candid friend, Ken Clark. Candid minister, Malcolm Rifkind. The candid, loyal friends, all with the same message. What hurt most of all was that this was treachery. Well, I had been away at an international conference, signing treaties on behalf of my country for the end of the Cold War. It was treachery with a smile on its face. Perhaps that was the worst thing of all.
There was no treachery against her. There was a pattern of events which was what it appeared to be, and a cabinet that was prepared to support her gave her wholly sensible advice that she had been defeated and she must now withdraw. That was good advice. She had been defeated. She had no chance of winning in the second ballot, and that was nothing to do with the cabinet. It was the parliamentary party where she'd suffered the defeat.
By 8:30 in the evening, the Prime Minister knew that without cabinet support she could not continue. The meetings with colleagues had left her emotionally devastated.
I came into the room and she broke down in tears, and I said, "Good luck, we're all with you." And she said, "I'm afraid it's all drifting away." And so I tried to reassure her and sort of squeezed her arm and said, "Well, look, don't worry, we're behind you. You know, I'm just trying to be helpful."
That really summed up the unreal world, to me, of the number 10 court or the number 10 bunker. The idea that she didn't need to worry about her parliamentary colleagues, about the party, that somehow all that mattered was the court and the courtiers remaining loyal to her, and that this could be any comfort to her, seemed to me to epitomise the state in which she'd allowed herself to become.
You wouldn't have believed it could have happened, but it had. And I knew that I would have to decide finally the next morning, as I always do. But at that moment, I dictated a statement that I would make if the following morning I had decided to go.
At 9 o'clock the next morning, Thursday the 22nd of November 1990, Margaret Thatcher's colleagues arrived for her last cabinet. She'd now decided finally to resign.
My study was upstairs. I came down the stairs, and all members of cabinet usually would have been scattered around the anteroom, and I'd have just gone through them and walked in. They were all kind of over the far side, and not meeting my eyes, and I just walked past and went in, and they followed me in.
She was sitting at the table. She was clearly upset. She'd clearly been crying, but she was all right at that moment. And she said, before cabinet begins, "I want to read you a statement which will be issued to the public at the end of cabinet." And she started to read the statement, saying that she was going to resign. And after reading a few words, she broke down, and then she started again, and she broke down.
Because I looked at them all. They had brought it about. They looked a bit sheepish, some of them. And that was a time, I'm afraid, when I did break down, because I realised then, for the first time, the full impact of what I was doing.
And I said, "Oh, for God's sake, James," meaning James Mackay, the Chancellor, who sat next to her, You read it. And there was a bit of an argument. People said, no, no, no. It only took seconds. But in those seconds, she recovered her composure and she read the statement out. And then one or two people started to say nice things about her. And she said something like, I'm much better at handling business than sympathy. Let's get on with the cabinet.
And after it was over, there was a look on their faces, some of them. What have we done? But it had been done. There was no turning back.
Margaret Thatcher left office reluctantly and unhappily.